If your only exposure to Star Wars is the films, or even just the films and all of the major TV series, the name Polis Massa probably doesn't ring a bell to you. If you played the original Star Wars Battlefront 2, meanwhile, it's probably giving you flashbacks to every NPC in the game pouring into the same choke point for 10 minutes until one side wears itself out. Polis Massa, for those who don't know, was the asteroid where Padme was taken to die in Revenge of the Sith, and it's actually a lot more interesting than its brief appearances in the film and in Battlefront suggest. In this video, we'll be telling the story of this unusual shattered world and the beings who came to call it home. Polis Massa was located just off the Hydian Way in the Subterral sector, a remote part of the Outer Rim with few visitors and few systems of any significance. The Subterral sector was the arse end of nowhere, far from the borders of the Republic and the CIS. Subterral was pretty much the only planet in the entire region with any significance, and that was an obscure mining world. If Subterral sounds familiar, that's because it was also mentioned in the films. In Attack of the Clones, Dexter Jettster said he was prospecting on Subterral when he last encountered Kaminoans. Polis Massa was even more remote and obscure than Subterral, as was the original homeworld of the people who called the system home. You might remember an odd species of thin, pale-faced aliens on Polis Massa in Revenge of the Sith. These beings are sometimes referred to as Polis Massans, but they were properly known as Kalidahins, and their original homeworld, Kalida, was located nearby, also in the Subterral sector. The Kalidahins evolved on Kalida, and they were highly unusual for a humanoid species. They were cetaceans, which means they're most like whales, and they had some traits that pointed to an aquatic origin. Their skin was thick and insulating, and their eyes were black and beady. Other features were more bizarre. Their fingers had tree-like growth rings, and their faces were completely featureless, covered by a pale osmotic membrane. Most Polis Massans were also mute by human standards, communicating through sign language and limited natural telepathy. The Kalidahins were a peaceful but insular people, preferring to keep to themselves. They only maintained regular relations with the Kaminoans, who were insular themselves. Unlike the Kaminoans, however, the Kalidahins had a deep fascination with and respect for life, familiar and alien-like. They were almost compulsive in their desire to learn as much as possible about other sentient species, but since their communication skills were rather poor, they preferred to do so through xenobiology and xenoarchaeology. The Kalidahins excelled in both of these fields, as well as in medical science. They were also well known for their discretion. Kalidahins were solid secret keepers and rarely asked questions whenever outsiders came to them for help. The Kalidahins were fairly advanced and invented space travel of their own accord, and they either invented or acquired hyperspatial travel as well. Once they had this technology, they set out to explore the worlds of the Subterral sector, analyzing and cataloging all the living beings they came across. But one system fascinated them more than any other, the one they named Polis Massa. This system was uninhabited, but it contained a huge asteroid field that Kalidahan scientists concluded had formed from the destruction of a habitable world. Archaeologists sent to the Polis Massa field discovered evidence that the ancient planet had been inhabited by a sentient species with an apparently advanced culture, one that bore no similarities to any other the Kalidahins were aware of. The Kalidahins were intrigued, as anyone would be, and in around 600 BBY, they established a settlement on the largest asteroid in the field, Polis Massa proper, the Polis Massa research base. From this initial settlement, the nature of the archaeological expedition grew, and by 519 BBY, the entire Kalidahan species had moved to Polis Massa to participate. They remained there, performing extensive surveys of the asteroids one by one for centuries. The Kalidahins spent all this time focused on two questions: who were the people who had lived on Polis Massa, and what caused their apparent destruction? The nature of the Polis Massa cataclysm, as it came to be known, stumped the Kalidahins, as well as the Republic researchers and Jedi archaeologists who occasionally popped in to help the Kalidahins on their work. It was unclear whether the cataclysm was natural, caused by a collision with another planet or something similar, or whether the planet had been destroyed by some superweapon in the ancient past, or perhaps as a result of some action on the part of the planet's native civilization. But the Kaledians were more preoccupied with the other question, that of who the original inhabitants of Polis Massa were and what they were like. They called them the Elians, and Kaledian archaeologists discovered many artifacts from their culture over the centuries. The most important find came in 59 BBY with the discovery of the ancient lost city of Wienta, from which the Kaledians learned much about the Elians and recovered countless artifacts. Curiously, this city and most of the other major artifacts the Kaledians found were located deep inside the planetoid. The Kaledians pored over these artifacts, looking for what they considered the greatest treasure of all, Elian genetic material. Their fixation with Elian genetics was because of a closely guarded secret that few non-Kaledians knew. The Kaledians' leading hypothesis was that the Elians had survived the Polis Massa cataclysm, fled the ruins of their homeworld, and settled on another planet, and they believed that the descendants of these ancient refugees were their ancestors. Incidentally, this would mean that the Kaledians really were Polis Massans, just in a roundabout way. Seeking to prove their ancestry by replicating and analysing Elian tissue, the Kaledians made a deal with the Kaminoans, who taught them some of their most closely guarded trade secrets in exchange for a boatload of xenobiological data the Kaledians had collected. Using Kaminoan cloning techniques, the Kaledians hoped to be able to clone at least part of an Elian for study, and though their 500-year dig had yet to turn up suitably intact genetic material for this, the Kaledians persisted in the hope of one day getting the answers they sought. For the most part, the Kaledians kept to themselves, and since Polis Massa was far removed from anything even remotely significant, they were generally allowed to do so. Ostensibly, they were allies or at least friends of the Republic and the Jedi, but their interactions with both orders were minimal. They stayed out of the Clone Wars, as the subterranean sector was beyond the borders of both the Republic and the CIS, and their obscurity kept them safe from the ravages of the conflict. But they became mixed up in galactic scale events just a day after the Clone Wars ended, when a Jedi ship fleeing Mustafar arrived on Polis Massa seeking medical aid for Senator Padme Amidala. The Kaledians provided Padme with the required medical care, and they provided shelter to Jedi refugees Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, as well as their ally, Senator Bail Organa. Padme, as we all know, died on Polis Massa, but before she did, she was able to give birth to twins she named Luke and Leia. On Polis Massa, the Jedi and their allies divided up the children and planned out their next moves. After arranging Padme's funeral, Bail left for Alderaan with Leia, Obi-Wan left for Tatooine with Luke, and Yoda left for Dagobah alone. But this wasn't the end of Polis Massa's involvement in galactic affairs. Not long after the Jedi left, a pair of Inquisitors were sent to investigate the station. The Kaledians managed to escape the wrath of the Empire, but this wasn't the last time that the Empire came calling. You'll recall that Bail Organa was also on Polis Massa when Padme died, and when he became one of the leaders of the Alliance to Restore the Republic, he tipped the other rebel leaders off to Polis Massa's value as a hideout. Throughout the Imperial period, the Kaledians secretly aided various rebel cells, helping them ship weapons and providing them with hideouts and medical care when they needed it. The Alliance actually built a base of its own on Polis Massa, which, in 0 BBY, was attacked by the Imperial 501st Legion, which believed the rebels at the Polis Massa base were hiding a stolen copy of the Death Star plans. The Imperials destroyed the rebel base, they found no stolen plans, and their attention was soon drawn away by other needs. Somehow, the Kaledians managed to escape Imperial subjugation yet again after this battle, and they continued with their archaeology, heedless to the fall of the Empire and the rise of the New Republic. Kessel is one of those planets that gets mentioned a lot in Star Wars media, but is seen a lot less. In canon, Kessel did make 2 major appearances in Star Wars Rebels, Solo, and Season 7 of Star Wars The Clone Wars, but even these appearances are somewhat lacking in detail, and they differ sharply with how Kessel was depicted in older Star Wars media. In Legends, Kessel was absolutely nothing like the sulfur-stained, smoke-shrouded planet seen in its more well-known depictions, and in this video, we're going to be examining it in detail. To understand Kessel's place in the galaxy, we first need to quickly consider the spice trade as a whole. Narcotic spice, not to be confused with cooking spice, came in a variety of forms that were found all over the galaxy, each with differing effects and uses. For most of Republic history, spice was legal, but heavily taxed and regulated from production to distribution, and legally acquired spice was generally used for medicinal purposes. But spice was also in high demand for use as a recreational substance, and there was a booming black market built around fulfilling this demand. In the waning years of the Republic, as Coruscant's ability to regulate the Outer Rim steadily diminished, spice smuggling and criminal enterprises built on the underground spice trade flourished, and formerly Republic-administered spice mines and distribution centers came into the hands of the Hutt Cartel, Black Sun, the Pike Syndicate, and many other criminal outfits. These organizations thrived in the chaos caused by the Clone Wars, only for the Galactic Empire to emerge and crack down on their operations. The Empire nationalized most of the galaxy's spice production and instituted draconian laws against the consumption and distribution of spice, with the stated aim of cracking down on addiction and social decline. Its actual aim, however, was to control the spice trade and the profits it generated. Spice production actually increased during the Imperial era, as the Empire turned many spice mines into penal colonies and sent convicts from all over the galaxy to work there as de facto slaves. Kessel was the most well-known of these penal colonies, and also one of the most dangerous. That was because Kessel wasn't just any old spice mine. It was the galaxy's only source of the most valuable and potent variety of spice, glitterstim. This exotic brand of space coke not only gave users the typical spice high, but also limited telepathic and empathetic capabilities, allowing them to feel the thoughts and emotions of other sentient beings for a brief spell. Owing to the ecstasy of this experience, it was also extraordinarily addictive, and excessive glitterstim use caused neural degeneration. Glitterstim addicts, derisively known as glitbiters, were identifiable by the symptoms of this degradation, the most common of which were loss of sight, paranoia, twitching, and nervousness. Still, some glitterstim addicts were able to hide their addiction well enough to achieve positions of power. Notable glitbiters included Figrin Da'an of the Modal Nodes and Imperial Grand Admiral Tuckle. Apart from its recreational uses though, glitterstim was also a potent medicinal substance, and its ability to grant temporary telepathic powers meant that it was constantly being studied by galactic intelligence agencies. This meant that Kessel's mines were always in operation, regardless of who controlled them. Kessel was located in the Kessel sector at the heart of the Morn Nebulae, a vast, tangled knot of star-forming regions that took up most of the sector. Most of the settled worlds in the Kessel sector were located on the nebulae's outskirts, but Kessel was located deep within the cluster. This made it incredibly hard to access, and there were only two routes linking Kessel to the outside galaxy. The official route was the Kessel Trade Corridor, which was heavily patrolled and wound between Kessel and Zerm on the Pabol Slaheron. The other was the Kessel Run, an unofficial, highly dangerous route that bypassed Republic and later Imperial patrols by running from Kessel to Formos on the Triellus trade route, weaving through blindingly bright nebulae, an asteroid field known as the Pit, and the Maw black hole cluster to reach the Kessel system. The dangers of the Kessel Run and the Maw cluster are a story for another time, however. The Kessel system itself consisted of 3 planets and a bunch of scattered asteroids orbiting the blue-white Type B star Kessel. 2 of these planets, the Molten Rock Senna and the Iceball Caretta, were barren and unimportant. Kessel, which lay between them, was the only part of the system worth visiting for the most part. Kessel was a misshapen lump of a planet, looking more like an asteroid than anything else, but it was considered a proper planet due to its size. It was only slightly smaller than your average terrestrial planet, and it was nearly twice the size of Mustafar. Why Kessel wasn't gravitationally rounded when its gravity, which was 0.82 standard, was strong enough that it should have been, is a mystery. Kessel's surface was mostly barren, consisting of jagged mountain ranges and empty alkali flats. It was cold and had only a tenuous atmosphere that was constantly being eroded by solar wind from Kessel, forcing the Republic to build factories on Kessel's surface that constantly pumped additional oxygen and nitrogen into the sky to replenish the atmosphere. Nonetheless, most sentients needed breath masks to be able to breathe on Kessel, at least outside of its climate-controlled habitats. There were quite a few of these, most of them mines, prisons, or both. There was also a single city on the planet, the military town known as Cassandra. Kessel had a single natural satellite, the Garrison Moon, which was barren and, unlike Kessel, gravitationally rounded. During the Imperial era, convicts bound for the spice mines were sent first to the Garrison Moon, which had been partially hollowed out to make way for an enormous prison complex, the Kessel Correctional Facility. The upper levels of this complex were dominated by docking bays, communications infrastructure, processing facilities, and slave pens, while the command center and local military garrison were housed on the lowest level of the facility. The Garrison Moon was the Empire's command center in the Kessel system, looming over the prisoners on the planet below night after night. Glitterstim was actually an organic substance produced by energy spiders native to Kessel. These spiders lived in pitch-black caves deep in the planet's crust, feeding on raw energy and spinning webs of glitterstim. They'd been doing this for long enough that veins of old glitterstim ran through Kessel's crust. The energy spiders were one of Kessel's only native species, and they were so unusual that they were sometimes theorized to be creations of the Celestials. They were also extremely dangerous. Their legs were tipped with razor-sharp talons, and they were completely resistant to blaster fire, since they fed on energy. They would often attack glitterstim miners, spraying webbing from their mouths to trap them before impaling their helpless prey and sucking out their life forces. As you might expect, the energy spiders made glitterstim mining highly dangerous. This was compounded by the fact that glitterstim was photoactive, so it had to be mined with primitive tools in complete darkness. This was a nightmarish experience in itself, but it was worsened by the fact that the darkness made accidents common, and it also left the miners vulnerable to spider attacks. In the lowest levels of the mines, spider attacks were so common that penal colony administrators often sent troublesome inmates down there to be disposed of. Life in the spice mines of Kessel was pure hell, a fate worse than death. It's unknown when Kessel's glitterstim nodes were discovered. The first known galactic power to lay claim to the planet was the Empire of Zim the Despot, which knew it as Zo's Eye, and there were also ancient ruins and temples scattered across the Alkali Flats that were thought to be of Sith origin. But the first known mines on Kessel were opened by the Galactic Republic not long after glitterstim's discovery. Originally, the Republic directly oversaw the mines, which were operated by volunteers, but as the Republic started to decline, its grip on Kessel loosened. At one point, the Republic contracted the Colicoids to run the mines, and during the Separatist crisis, it lost control of Kessel altogether, allowing it to fall under the control of the Hutt Cartel and the Pike Syndicate, the latter of which had grown tremendously wealthy by smuggling spice along the Kessel Run. They manned the spice mines via slave labor. After the Clone Wars, the Hutts and Pikes were driven out by the Empire, which took direct control of Kessel and transformed it into the most brutal penal colony in the galaxy. The Empire too used slave labor to man the mines, this time in the form of prisoners brought in from all over the galaxy. After the Battle of Endor, Kessel came under the rule of a series of Imperial warlords before being liberated by the New Republic circa 11 ABY. The New Republic freed all the slaves on Kessel, and the planet was bought by Lando Calrissian, who brought in Nien Nunb as the planet's new administrator. Lando brought in a new droid workforce to work the mines, while Nien Nunb founded a small colony of cave-dwelling sentients with good night vision in Kessel's cave, where they formed a thriving community that oversaw glitterstim production. So, somehow, Kessel ended up getting a happy ending. A Across the galaxy, there have been many worlds central to the development of society as we know it. Coruscant, the heart of the Republic, immediately comes to mind, as do Ossus and Korriban, the birthplaces of the Jedi and Sith orders. Many others, like Alsaken and Corellia, made their own indelible marks on history. In most cases, however, planets with significantly smaller contributions to the Republic's history were lesser known and less important in the grand scheme of things. But not all cases. Some planets held deep meaning, crucial in their own right. Without them, the shape of the galaxy would be very different even if they weren't Coruscant or Corellia. In today's video, we'll be talking about just one such world, Ilum, and the many ways it was important to the galaxy. Located in the Ilum system of the unknown regions, Ilum was a tiny ice ball of a planet similar to Hoth. Its surface mainly consisted of vast snow fields, rocky frozen peaks, and crystallized glaciers. Frost-resistant trees formed the occasional forest, but for the most part, the planet's fauna was left to fend for itself in the open snow and ice. The only real source of warmth came in the form of underground geysers that expelled hot water into the planet's caverns. This geothermal activity was caused by volcanoes that never seemed to erupt. It had 2 moons and was the 5th planet in its system, orbiting the blue dwarf sun Assar. But that wasn't why it was such a contested world. The real reason Ilum was important was its kyber crystalline core and, as by extension, the vast amount of kyber crystals. In many caverns on Ilum, glowing formations of kyber crystals could be found and mined. As we're sure you all know, kyber crystals were force-attuned living crystals that could channel energy. They were used by the Jedi to construct their lightsabers for tens of thousands of years, but their uses didn't stop there. Kyber crystals could be used as power sources and amplifiers, so over the millennia, the various iterations of the Sith Empire sought to use them as well. Darth Sidious would be no exception to this pattern. After the fall of the Galactic Republic, the Empire gathered kyber crystals to power the Death Star's powerful laser. But more on that later. Long before people dreamed of powerful battle stations that could destroy planets in one single hit, there were the Jedi. When kyber crystals became the standard power source in their sabers, Ilum became a sacred place for the Order. This was typical for the Jedi. When a location had an abundance of kyber crystals, they tended to erect Jedi temples or academies nearby. Such had been the case with Dantooine, where a Jedi enclave had been built near the Dantian caves, which also contained kyber crystals. Ilum wasn't an exception. In no time after its crystal surplus was discovered, a Jedi temple was built, and the crystal-rich caverns were converted into a sacred Jedi place, the Crystal Caves. We're sure you all remember the Clone Wars episode The Gathering. In it, a group of Padawan, supervised by Master Yoda, are taken to Ilum in order to gather their first lightsaber crystal. To the Jedi, this was an age-old ritual. It was a task much more daunting than simply walking into a cave and picking a crystal. It was a trial designed to make or break a Padawan's resolve and prove whether they were truly ready to become a Jedi. As shown in The Gathering and Jedi Fallen Order, the way the crystal caves were set up was deliberate. The doors were always sheathed in a thick layer of ice that prevented anyone from entering or leaving. At the entrance to the caverns, a temple had been erected, and in this small antechamber, the Jedi had put together a mechanism to thaw the ice. Glass or crystal prisms were positioned so that, when the sunlight struck them, they would amplify the light and focus it on the ice, melting it and clearing the path for prospective Padawan to enter. Of course, the sun wouldn't remain in place for long. Padawan hoping to enter the caves and gather their crystals were on a time limit, and if they waited too long, they would be trapped within. That's the official Jedi line, at least. We're pretty sure the Order of Compassionate Warrior Monks wouldn't really leave a tween stuck inside forever, but the threat was a great way of making Padawan feel a sense of urgency. Once they'd entered the caves, the Padawan were on their own. It was far more than just grabbing the shiniest or prettiest crystal. Remember that kyber crystals were living crystals connected to the Force. Padawan weren't to just pick a crystal, but the crystal. One that spoke to them through the Force and resonated with them. Once they were in the caverns, it was their task to open themselves up to the Force and find their crystal. The caves, however, didn't make this easy. With such a high concentration of Force-attuned crystals, the very crystal caves themselves were rich in the Force. Entering them wasn't the same as walking into any other cave. Once inside, Padawan were tested by the Force itself. Thoughts that sounded very much like their own whispered doubts into their heads that would chip away at their resolve. Visions would appear, designed to trigger their worst fears. In short, the caves would expose the Jedi's weaknesses and force them to confront them. If they were successful, they would be guided to find their crystal. If not, some sources state they would be lost. Again, given how benevolent the Jedi Order was, our money's on them being rescued and given counseling to overcome their weaknesses, and if that failed again, they'd be moved to the Service Corps or other Jedi-adjacent services. But the trial of gathering was truly the first test a young Jedi would face. Given that, once they obtained their sabers, they would go out into the galaxy and be tested by the real world. It was an important step in winnowing out those who weren't ready for the challenges ahead. Unfortunately for the Jedi, external forces didn't let them have their sacred gathering grounds uncontested. The story starts peacefully enough. Soon after the formation of the Jedi Order, a scout navigated through hyperspace with the guidance of the Force, only to land upon the veritable Force beacon that was Ilum. The Order swarmed the planet, establishing a hyperspace route to it, surveying its landscape, pinpointing where crystals could be found, and generally securing this treasure trove. Initially, they built a Jedi temple there, but eventually abandoned the planet entirely. Mentions of Ilum were erased from star maps, and only those who needed to know remained in the know. Younglings were still sent there to gather their crystals, but it was no longer a Jedi base. For millennia, the balance remained. Jedi would go to the planet to gather crystals, but that was it. That was until Order 66. After it was initially carried out, troopers of the 481st Legion were sent to Ilum to hunt down any Jedi that may have fled to it for shelter. By 18 BBY, the Empire was on Ilum, though what they did there varied depending on continuity. In Legends, Ilum was largely forgotten. Initially, it was used as a refuge by Jedi fleeing the Purge, but the Empire soon took over the planet and killed the Jedi hiding there. They maintained a small garrison on Ilum afterwards, sealing off the crystal caves and guarding them against any Jedi fugitives that might try to enter. Nonetheless, the garrison there was small and chronically undersupplied, with a posting on Ilum being more of a punishment than anything. In canon though, the Empire established more extensive facilities on Ilum, and they weren't shy in exploiting its resources. Immediately, they settled its surface and began strip mining it for kyber crystals. They destroyed the Jedi Temple leading to the crystal caves, making access easier for their mining operations. However, they mined too greedily and too deep. Those volcanoes we mentioned in the beginning had been dormant, but now magma began bubbling its way up to the surface. They even dug an entire mining ship into its surface in an effort to get as much out of it as they could, leaving huge trench scarring on its surface that was visible from orbit. As a result of this overmining, Ilum's presence in the Force slowly diminished the more the Force-attuned crystals were stripped clean. The planet became barren and polluted. In many ways, it was a sad testament to how brutally the Empire would tear anything in its way down. But because no sentience lived on its surface, its loss was a silent one. After the Battle of Jakku between the Galactic Empire and the newly established New Republic, a handful of high-ranking officers and personnel escaped into the unknown regions to form the First Order. Its first order was establishing the Starkiller Project, which was based on Ilum. For 30 years, they continued mining down to Ilum's core for a very specific reason. They turned the Imperial Trench the Empire had established into a superweapon, with the planet's very core the power array. Ilum had become a living Death Star. In 34 ABY, they used their new superweapon to destroy the Hosnian system. The Hosnian Cataclysm, as it became known, was a devastatingly destabilizing blow to the New Republic. The Resistance managed to find its location, however, and launched an attack on the base that saw the superweapon destroyed. Sadly, Ilum went with it. When the kyber core exploded,
so too did the planet. All that energy collapsed inwards, taking with it millennia of history and tradition. Ilum imploded in a burst of fire and ice, shining brightly with the force of a newly born star before being extinguished for the last time. Well, at least it survived intact in legends. Ilum was just another story of how the Empire ruined everything. It, at least, saw no sentient casualties.
Since Heir to the Empire catapulted Star Wars back into popular consciousness in 1991, the Chiss have been one of the most iconic symbols of the expanded universe. But both among fans and in universe, the Chiss were mostly known only for their species' most famous member, Grand Admiral Thrawn. The Chiss themselves are largely a mystery. Nonetheless, there's a fair bit of information about the Chiss in Legends if you know where to look, and in this video, we'll be giving you a rundown on them and their civilization, the Chiss Ascendancy. The Chiss were an interesting species, biologically speaking. They were classified as near humans, as they were very similar in most respects. But Chiss diverged from humanity in several ways. Externally, they had blue skin and red eyes, the shade of which became more intense the more oxygen was present in their surroundings. Most Chiss had jet black hair, but elderly Chiss occasionally had their hair go grey, which the Chiss believed was the mark of having sired exceptional children. Internally, Chiss had better metabolisms than humans, and they also matured much faster, reaching adulthood at 10 years old. In most other respects, however, they were pretty much identical to humans. This wasn't a matter of convergent evolution. DNA analysis indicated that the Chiss were descended from humans just far removed from the species' baseline. Their ancestors were believed to have been the crew of an ancient Coruscanti sleeper ship, one of many shot off into the stars around 27,500 BBY. Most of these sleeper ships settled in worlds in the core, while a few landed in the Tython cluster far in the outer rim. But one sleeper ship went further than all the others, straying far into the unknown regions, where it eventually landed on the remote planet, Csilla. Csilla, initially, was cold, but not overwhelmingly so, with a temperate equatorial region and vast polar glaciers. The Chiss settled there and quickly diverged from their human ancestors, becoming their own species with their own distinct culture and government. In 5000 BBY, long after the formation of the Chiss Ascendancy, Csilla entered an ice age that saw its glaciers grow to cover the entire planet, something that happened to Earth a few times in the distant past. But the Chiss survived this, and remarkably, they did so without all that much upheaval. They simply moved their cities underground, building warrens heated by geothermal activity. Either around this time or several millennia earlier, the Chiss returned to the stars, invented an analog of the hyperdrive, and formed their own interstellar empire, much as their distant relatives back in the Republic were doing around this time. This was the Chiss Ascendancy, which soon became the most powerful civilization in the unknown regions. It consisted only of a measly 29 worlds, but it covered a vast swath of space which doubtlessly contained hundreds of uncharted habitable systems. Combined, these 29 worlds had a respectably large population, with Csilla, the capital, home to 8 billion Chiss. The Ascendancy was governed by the ruling families, 9 clans of aristocrats that each oversaw a particular aspect of Chiss policy, ruled alongside a democratically elected parliament from the city of Sapla. The number of ruling families varied. At one point, there were only 3, while at others there were as many as 12. Of the 9 ruling families, 4 were the most prominent and controlled the government, while the other 5 jockeyed for lesser positions of power. Of the 4 leading families, House Sabosin managed social issues, House Nuruudo managed foreign affairs and warfare, House Inrokini oversaw science and industry, and House Sapla managed colonization efforts and the Ascendancy's economy. In spite of its oligarchic structure and prominent aristocracy, the Chiss Ascendancy had an almost socialistic command economy that prioritized equitable distribution of resources, and its culture had strong meritocratic principles. Chiss culture also emphasized military strength. They had a strong, advanced, and disciplined military that consisted of the colonial phalanxes,
which were defensive fleets divided between different Chiss worlds, and the Chiss Expansionary Defense Force, which patrolled the borders of the Ascendancy. The latter was always vigilant, as the Chiss were surrounded by enemies on all sides, threatened by the Vogari, the Siruk, the Kilix, and later scout ships of the Yuuzhan Vong. They believed the Ascendancy was a bastion of civilization amidst the endless threats of the unknown regions, and their constant conflicts with their alien neighbors made the Chiss a bit xenophobic and strongly distrusting of outsiders. Thus, even when they had the means to make contact with the Galactic Republic, they didn't, choosing to stay out of the affairs of the greater galaxy. Chiss territory was based around Csilla, which sat at a junction of hyperspace routes at roughly the center of the Chiss Ascendancy's core territory. Each of the ruling houses had their own throne world, each subordinate to Csilla. These were located along the path of the houses, a route that ran north to south across Ascendancy territory, which Csilla was located at the middle of. 5 throne worlds were located south of Csilla. These were Sirral, the urbanized home of House Tsatsapla, Savchi, home of House Chaff, and most of the few non-Chiss citizens of the Ascendancy, Kopero, a shipyard world home to House Myth, Kossos, home of House Inronkini, and a major scientific hub, and Rigam, located in the Ratan Nebula, a snowy world home to the foremost Chiss military academy, the auxiliary throne world of House Naruto. Those north of Csilla were Sposia, home of many prominent academics, and House Sabosen, and Napara, the home of House Naruto and the Chiss Admiralty. North of Napara were a selection of Chiss throne worlds whose ruling families had been wiped out. Those on Ornfra, Shab, Norris, and Shesar were destroyed by civil war, while those on Katlia and Massos, which were east of the Ascendancy's core territory along the Phalanx route, were assimilated by the Kilix. The Chiss Ascendancy also included a number of less important colonies. Close to Csilla were Rentor and Jamiron, while east along the Vagari corridor was Kormit, a major military staging ground. The north and south borders of the Ascendancy, respectively, were guarded by colonial stations Kamko and Chuff on the Chasdemunus route. West of Csilla were a further half-dozen colonies, those being Avidich, Ul, Shihon, Oyokal, Theatera, and Kinos. Kinos guarded the Ascendancy's western border, while the others were all unique in minor ways. Our favourite is Shihon, the native species of which were all boneless. The Chiss also had a number of colony worlds outside their home territories. We already mentioned Katlia and Massos, the former homes of ill-fated ruling houses on the Phalanx Run, near which were the border colonies Tanupe and Krustai. Closer to the core territories was Kelwis, a border world on the Vagari corridor, a remote military installation on the way of Chesa, which led from Chiss space to the Redoubt, a star cluster on the very fringe of Republic space. Pesfavari was built up as a precaution against Republic colonists heading too deep into the unknown regions. Most of the history of the Chiss Ascendancy is unknown. Like the Galactic Republic, the Ascendancy was ancient, with a history stretching back many thousands of years. Much of this time was spent battling aggressive neighbors and exploring the unknown regions. The Chiss actually mapped a big chunk of the unknown regions, even though they only inhabited a small corner of it, and established hyperspace routes led out from the Ascendancy's core territory in all directions, to places no citizen of the Republic had ever heard of. Most of what we know of the Ascendancy's history comes from their scattered interactions with the greater galaxy. As far back as the old Sith Wars, there were hyperspace routes connecting Chiss space with the Republic, and while these were extraordinarily obscure, they allowed a section of Chiss goods, such as the Charuk rifles, to find their way into Republic space. The Chiss Ascendancy's first known involvement in galactic affairs came in 3681 BBY, when the Chiss allied with the Sith Empire against the Republic in the Great Galactic War. The Chiss only had a tenuous involvement in the Galactic Wars. They didn't do any fighting, and their alliance with the Sith Empire was mostly just a glorified trade agreement. But it was substantial enough that some Chiss Force sensitives were recruited by the Sith during this period. The Sith Empire lost the Galactic Wars in the end, however, and after its collapse, the Chiss again removed themselves from galactic affairs, and the Republic and the Ascendancy went back to ignoring each other. Their next contact with the outside galaxy was a few years before 1000 BBY, during the last stages of the new Sith Wars, when agents of the Brotherhood of Darkness, remembering the Sith Empire's old alliance with the Sith, recruited a regiment of Chiss to join them. These Chiss relocated to Thule, where they joined a secret legion of Sith-aligned elite soldiers that had lived on the planet for millennia. They merged with the Thulean population and stuck around for centuries, covertly serving the Sith during the period of the Rule of Two. Just prior to the Clone Wars, Count Dooku also recruited a pair of Chiss agents, the Dark Acolyte Severance Tan and her lover Vandalore, both of whom died a few months into the war. The Jedi Order also had a Chiss recruit around this time, Kon'me Bal'Demnic, a Padawan who served as a Jedi commander during the Clone Wars. But the most well-known Chiss agent to participate in the affairs of the greater galaxy was recruited 5 years before the start of the wars. Commander Mithril Naruto of the CEDF, better known as Thrawn, was recruited by Darth Sidious to shoot down the Jedi exploratory ship Outbound Flight in 27 BBY, following which the two men established a partnership. This and other aggressive actions of Thrawn's led him to being exiled from the Chiss Ascendancy around 20 BBY, a few years after which he joined the Galactic Empire, eventually rising to the rank of a Grand Admiral. On Sidious's behest, Thrawn spent the reign of the Empire on campaign in the unknown regions, exploring and forming alliances with the species he discovered there. In the northern quadrant of the unknown regions, between the Chiss Ascendancy and the Empire, Thrawn established the Empire of the Hand, meant as a bulwark against the coming Yuuzhan Vong invasion and a last redoubt of Imperial power. Said Yuuzhan Vong invasion ultimately brought the Chiss Ascendancy into more extensive contact with the greater galaxy, but that, we think, is a story for another time. In Star Wars, planets have a tendency of being monolithic. The character of planets is often consistent across thousands of years in Star Wars media. Tatooine is always the backwater desert, Coruscant is always the center of the galaxy, and so on. But not all planets stayed the same over the millennia, and some worlds played vastly different roles in different eras of galactic history. One such planet was Telos 4, a world with a troubled history that saved the Republic in one war and fought against it in another. Telos was discovered by the Republic in the years after the Great Hyperspace War, and for several centuries, it was a blessed world, prosperous and peaceful. It was a major Republic foothold in a little explored part of the Outer Rim, and during the Mandalorian Wars, it was an important Republic military stronghold. It was also the homeworld of the Agricultural Corps, a joint Republic Jedi Order initiative that allowed Jedi initiates who failed to become Padawans to serve the galaxy as farmers, using their limited Force talents to nurture crops. All told, Telos was a beautiful planet, but all that changed when the Sith attacked. At the start of the Jedi Civil War, Telos was one of the first planets targeted by Darth Revan's Sith Empire. On the command of Darth Malak, Admiral Saw Karath led a Sith fleet to Telos and razed the entire surface of the planet, killing most of the population and devastating its ecology. The bombardment turned Telos' surface to ash and made its atmosphere toxic and corrosive, forcing the entire Telosian population to evacuate. Telos wasn't the only planet to suffer such a fate during the Old Sith Wars, and after the Jedi Civil War was over, the Galactic Senate began an initiative to restore these destroyed worlds. It chose to begin with Telos, inviting a herd of Ithorians to terraform the planet back to life. In the hard years after the Jedi Civil War, the Republic was struggling just to keep itself together, but it nonetheless put everything into the Telos restoration project. In desperation, it banked everything on the hope that this ruined world could be revived. The restoration project faced many challenges along the way. It depended on fuel from Paragus 2 and imports of flora and fauna from Onderon, causing problems when Paragus was destroyed and Onderon descended into civil war. The greatest threat of all was Darth Nihilus, who, in 3951 BBY, attacked Telos and attempted to destroy it again. But with the help of Jedi exile Mitra Surik and her allies, the Telosians and the Republic rallied, and Telos was able to overcome all of these threats. Telos' trade issues were resolved, Darth Nihilus was destroyed, and the restoration project was allowed to continue. Telos, ultimately, was what allowed the Republic to survive this period known as the Dark Wars. The Telosians themselves, of course, could do little to help the Republic, but the idea of the restoration project ended up being a much-needed rallying point. As the reduced Republic military struggled just to patrol its own territory, it drew a line at Telos, showing up to defend the planet when Darth Nihilus attacked and attempted to destroy it again. Telos was where the Republic and the greater galaxy decided that they would decline no further. They would stand back up and fight to put the galaxy back together. It was where the allies of the Jedi rallied and destroyed Darth Nihilus, ending the terrible threat the Lord of Hunger posed to the galaxy. Above all, it was a symbol of hope, and the Republic would not have survived without it. The Telos Restoration Project wasn't only insanely expensive, but an incredible amount of work. The Republic and Telosians started by building an enormous space station, Citadel Station, above the planet, a construct so enormous that it covered a full quarter of the planet. On the planet below, the Ithorians, with the help of Zabrak engineer Bal'Demnic, built a network of shield walls that divided Telos into restoration zones. The Ithorians then worked on the restoration zones one by one, using Citadel Station to scrub and rebalance the atmosphere while they implanted Onderonian flora and fauna on the surface below. To the Ithorians, the most important step of the process was a religious one. They performed every step of the task with great reverence, and their ultimate focus was opening the planet back up to the Force so that it could thrive again. The Ithorians were eventually successful. When their work was finished, Telos was not only restored, but improved. It was generally acknowledged that the Ithorians made Telos even more beautiful than it had been before, bringing life back to the planet with renewed vigor. Its barren wastelands became flowering meadows and verdant forests. At first, Telos' primary industry was agriculture, as it had been before the Jedi Civil War, but Telosian agriculture was quickly overshadowed by tourism, which made Telos a prosperous world once more. For centuries, the Telosians took great pride in the beauty of their homeworld, banning industrial development across much of the countryside, preserving plenty of land for use as national parks, and protected sacred places. In urban areas, business thrived, and many major technological advancements happened on Telos, such as the development of opaque transparasteel. The planet also became a cultural hub with a thriving artist community, many members of which derived inspiration from the planet's restored natural beauty. In short, Telos had become the Alderaan of the Outer Rim, except without that whole monarchy business. But Telos' prosperity didn't last. For reasons unknown, the last century of Republic history was extremely hard on Telos. In 94 BBY, the planet was swept by a severe famine, the effects of which continued to be felt for decades. But the worst blow came 40 years later, when Telos suffered a destructive civil war. In 53 BBY, Governor Cryon of Telos attempted to renegotiate a treaty with a neighboring planet, and as a formality, the Jedi Order dispatched a team to monitor the negotiations. The Jedi sent were Qui-Gon Jinn and his first Padawan, Xanatos. As it turned out, Xanatos was Cryon's son, who the governor had given to the Order as an infant. Cryon had come to regret giving up his son in the years since, and he was overjoyed to see Xanatos again. Xanatos, for his part, was deeply conflicted about seeing his father. Indeed, the reason the Jedi Council had sent him on this mission was so that he could confront and overcome the strong emotions he often struggled with. As it turned out, this was a colossal mistake. Cryon revealed to Xanatos that his real motives for renegotiating the treaty were to dominate the neighboring planet and seize control of its industry and resources for Telos, and he asked his son to help him accomplish this goal. He eventually won Xanatos over to helping him, and Xanatos attempted to keep Qui-Gon in the dark about the whole thing. But Qui-Gon found out anyway, and unaware of his apprentice's role in the plot, he revealed Cryon's scheme to the people of Telos, who were outraged. The Telosians rose up in revolution against Governor Cryon, but rather than back down and submit to the people, Cryon and his son hired a mercenary army and ordered them to slaughter the masses in a bid to quell the uprising. Qui-Gon ultimately helped the people overthrow Cryon, but he was forced to kill the governor in the process, which pushed Xanatos to the dark side. After the Telosian civil war, the people of Telos purged the government of corruption and began to rebuild once more. But a decade later, Xanatos returned. By this point, he had settled into a new role as a renegade Dark Jedi,
and in 44 BBY, he used the power of the dark side and a clique of corporate allies to seize control of Telos. He manipulated the Telosian populace with extensive propaganda, making the once peaceful people much more violent and distracting them from his misdeeds with regular gladiatorial shows. All the while, Xanatos and his corporate allies began desecrating the sacred places, exploiting parts of them for resources. Xanatos was ultimately foiled by Qui-Gon and his latest apprentice, Obi-Wan Kenobi, who exposed Xanatos' misdeeds and helped the Telosians drive him and his allies from the government. The second crisis ended when Xanatos committed suicide to avoid facing justice for his crimes, and the Telosian government was purged once more. But this time, the damage was done. The corporation Xanatos had brought to Telos remained, and they continued to enjoy great influence in the government and access the resources of the sacred places. During the Clone Wars, Telos joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems. The reason is unknown, but it likely had something to do with the influence of separatist-aligned corporations or the crises the Jedi had inadvertently caused. Either way, Telos went from being the savior of the Republic to joining in its destruction. In Star Wars The Bad Batch, more casual Star Wars fans were introduced to one of the galaxy's most infamous shadow ports, Ord Mantell. First mentioned all the way back in The Empire Strikes Back, Ord Mantell has appeared in a ton of Star Wars media over the years, and it's been mentioned in even more. This planet's reputation precedes it, the reputation of a lawless smuggler's haunt. But there's actually a lot more layers to this planet than is immediately apparent, and in this video, we're going to be digging through them all. Located in the Bright Jewel system of the Mid-Rim's Bright Jewel sector, Ord Mantell was first settled by the Republic around 12,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, and for millennia it was one of the Republic's few outposts in the New Territories, the then unexplored northern wedge of the galaxy. For thousands of years, it was one of the Republic's most remote colonies, acting as a base for scouts heading further out into the New Territories. But it was originally settled for far less mundane reasons. The planet was first discovered by Corellian colonists who established the planet's first settlements, but the planet was quickly taken over by the Republic, which transformed it into a military staging ground. The Republic at the time was rapidly descending into xenophobia, and it would soon be taken over by the Pius Dea cult, which used the Republic military to wage genocidal crusades against non-human species all across the Rim. It waged these wars from military outposts known as ordnance/regional depots, which served as mustering points for the Crusaders and key links in their supply chains. The Pius Dea were ultimately overthrown by a Jedi-led coalition, but their crusades left their mark on the galaxy, and even 10,000 years later, many former ordnance/regional depots still bore the prefix Ord Mantell among them. And Ord Mantell wasn't just any ordnance/regional depot, it was one of the most important ones, the primary depot for the whole New Territories. It was the rallying point for the xenophobic armies that persecuted the Ithorians and Zabraks during the Great Northern Crusade and other campaigns like it, and much of the planet's early infrastructure was built on plunder, on the innocent bloodshed by the Pius Dea. And even as Ord Mantell was being used as a mustering ground for one set of crusaders, its settlers were carrying out a crusade of their own. Ord Mantell, you see, was never uninhabited. It had its own indigenous sentient species, the Mantellian Savrips. These titanic reptiles were considered primitive by the standards of outsiders, but they had their own rudimentary language, wore clothing, and made use of simple weapons. Nonetheless, their societies were tribal, hunter-gatherer affairs. The Corellian settlers considered them to just be particularly cunning animals. The Corellians' expansionist philosophy brought them into conflict with the Savrips, which led to the Savrips being hunted nearly to extinction over the course of millennia. By the time of the Empire, there were few Mantillian Savrips left, and the galaxy remembered them mostly for being pieces on the standard Dejarik board. What's more, committing genocide against Ord Mantell's native peoples wasn't enough for the planet's settlers. They destroyed the planet itself too. The early settlers on Ord Mantell were farmers, and even by the time of the Empire, the bulk of the planet was still rural.
But the equatorial regions of the planet were dominated by urban sprawl, industrial zones, and vast junkyards, which thoroughly polluted large swaths of the planet. Millennia of industrial activity, including the burning of fossil fuels, poured tons of pollutant gases into Ord Mantell's atmosphere, causing its climate to warm and its polar ice caps to melt. By the time of the Empire, Ord Mantell had been completely transformed by the settlers and completely ruined, most would say. At the very poles, Ord Mantell was mostly mountains, tundra, and seas, with coasts defined by dramatic fjords carved by ice that had long since melted. Its equatorial regions were dominated by urban sprawl, junkyards, and coal yards, as well as scattered forests and seas. The coal yards and industrial zones stretched far into the planet's interior, keeping most of Ord Mantell shrouded with brown smog and pink clouds. The planet's oceans were dotted with volcanic islands. Its shores typically consisted of steel cliffs and mountain ranges stretched all across the planet, with plateaus and open plains between them. Ord Mantell had 2 large moons, both of which orbited fairly close, and as a result, ground quakes and other forms of tectonic activity were common. Apart from the twin moons, Ord Mantell had 15 natural satellites, as well as the ring-shaped space station Jubilee Wheel. The planet had a total population of 4 billion, divided between isolated farming communities in the planet's outback and urban population in the industrial zones. A majority of the population lived in Ord Mantell's equatorial cities, which were full of casinos and tourist traps. These areas were fairly safe, and they saw an average of 1 billion tourists a year due to Ord Mantell's location at the nexus of several major hyperspace routes. Other urban areas were much more shady, smugglers' haunts and shadow ports that were the heart of the planet's thriving criminal underworld. Though large parts of Ord Mantell were dominated by farms, the planet's economy was primarily industrial. Ord Mantell manufactured and distributed consumer goods, and it also continued to serve as a military base and weapons depot well after the time of the Pius Dea. These industries were largely controlled by Ord Mantell's powerful criminal underworld, which practically controlled the entire planet. Ord Mantell had a central government, the Ord Mantell Central Authority, which was led by a governor and based in Wallport, the planet's capital city. However, this government was completely corrupt, more of a shell for the planet's criminal operations than anything else. Most criminal factions had a presence on Ord Mantell, and they competed for control of the planet. In particular, Black Sun had a strong presence on Ord Mantell by the time of the Clone Wars. After the defeat of the Pius Dea, Ord Mantell ceased to be a Crusaders' hub, but it remained a Republic military outpost, and its settlers' atrocities against the planet's natives continued. For thousands of years, Ord Mantell was known mostly as an archetypal middle-of-nowhere planet, but as the Republic slowly pushed into the new territories and its industrial sector developed, the planet became increasingly significant. This led to a number of battles on the planet over the course of the Republic's later millennia. It was conquered by the Neo-Crusaders during the Mandalorian Wars, racked by a civil war with a local separatist faction during the Cold War, and defended from Sith aggression by the Jedi during the New Sith Wars. During the Republic's final centuries, Ord Mantell became a regional hub, one of the most politically powerful and economically significant planets in the new territories. This power largely stemmed from its thriving criminal underworld, which made Ord Mantell, or parts of it anyway, fairly wealthy. It also made the planet thoroughly corrupt, however, leading to Jedi intervention on multiple occasions. During the Clone Wars, Ord Mantell was the headquarters for the Republic's 8th Sector Army, nicknamed Bright Jewel Command, which was in charge of the campaigns against the intergalactic banking clan's strongholds on the Republic's northern periphery. Bright Jewel Command took over Ord Mantell's old military bases and weapons depots, and it used the planet in much the same way the Pius Dea Crusaders once had, as a command post, mustering ground, and a key link in their supply chain. Ord Mantell also had a strong Black Sun presence during the Clone Wars, which led to the planet becoming briefly involved with the Shadow Collective later in the war. It was attacked by separatist forces under the command of General Grievous twice. One attack was directed against Republic military forces early in the war, and another later in the war was directed at Black Sun's strongholds. During the Clone Wars, the Galactic Senate ensured Ord Mantell's loyalty to the Republic by straight up bribing the planet's government,
but this practice ended after the rise of the Empire, as the Empire chose to occupy the planet and keep it in line through military force instead. Predictably, this led to Mantell contributing great sums of money to the Alliance to restore the Republic, which the Alliance used to fund the construction of Echo Base on Hoth. After the Battle of Endor, Mantell was taken by the New Republic, though it saw battles several times during the later stages of the Galactic Civil War, as the Imperial remnants were strongest in the new territories. During the Yuuzhan Vong War, Mantell was flooded with refugees from the Vong's first targets, and it was attacked directly by the Vong early in the war, though it was successfully defended by Mandalorian warriors. The knotted tendrils of time loosened, and he had a glimpse into Bal'Demnic's future. Embroiled in a multi-fronted war, a galactic war, in part because of its rich deposits of cortosis, but more as a pawn in a convoluted game, the subservient Kon'me turned against those who had mastered them for eons. This was a vision that came to Darth Plagueis as the title of Dark Lord of the Sith passed to him and the balance of galactic power began to shift. 48 years later, as the Clone Wars reached a climax, this vision became reality as the planet Bal'Demnic and its Kon'me natives were wrapped up in a vast battle for galactic supremacy. But the Battle of Bal'Demnic was unlike most other battles of the Clone Wars, as neither the Galactic Republic nor the Confederacy of Independent Systems won the day. No, it was the native Kon'me who won that battle, a battle they fought against both sides. In this video, we'll be telling the story of Bal'Demnic and how it survived the Clone Wars. Bal'Demnic was a rather insignificant world in the Outer Rim's Aural sector, far removed from the core worlds. Visually speaking, it was a beautiful world, mostly covered by vast azure oceans. What landmasses it had were rugged and strewn with stunning canyons and cliffs. But the beauty of Bal'Demnic was somewhat spoiled for outsiders by its suboptimal climate. The planet was almost scorching hot for most of the year, with an unpleasant atmosphere, regular seismic events, and fearsome storms. This planet was the home of the reptilian Kon'me, a species of hunchbacked, broad-shouldered lizardfolk. Their society was starkly divided between two castes, an upper and a lower caste. The upper caste Kon'me ruled the planet and lived in beautiful cliffside cities of steel and glass, while the lower caste Kon'me served them and were relegated to small villages of thatch-roofed huts on the seashores. The Kon'me were deeply distrusting of outsiders and resented alien interference on their planet, choosing to remain as isolated as possible from the galaxy at large. But the Kon'me were never able to completely cut themselves off from the greater galaxy. Despite the remoteness of their homeworld, Bal'Demnic was discovered by the Republic very early in its history, as the planet was near the Polemian trade route and the Jedi homeworld of Ossus. Bal'Demnic was incorporated into the Republic, something the Kon'me grudgingly accepted, so long as the Republic didn't interfere in their affairs. For most of galactic history, the Kon'me were left well enough alone, but as you can imagine, this didn't last. That was because, unbeknownst to the Kon'me, their homeworld cliffs were rich in cortosis. Cortosis was a rare metal that was found on a number of worlds across the galaxy. It was renowned for its extreme durability, its usefulness for conducting energy, and most importantly, its ability to stand up to lightsaber blades. For thousands of years, cortosis was allowed into armor or swords to allow them to parry lightsaber blades, while armor or weapons made from pure cortosis had the ability to short out lightsabers on contact, disabling them for several minutes. With all that in mind, it should go without saying that cortosis was highly sought after. During the Republic Golden Age, it became particularly valuable as the Republic seized control of all known cortosis mines and heavily regulated the metals trade with the intent of protecting the Jedi. Bal'Demnic's cortosis deposits were discovered in 67 BBY by the Subtext Mining Corporation, which determined that the planet's crust contained large quantities of the metal. Instead of notifying the Republic, as was legally required of them, Subtext instead notified renowned Bith shipwright Ruges Nome, a contact of theirs who had expressed interest in purchasing cortosis on the down low. Nome's stated interest in cortosis had something to do with the starships he was designing, but in reality, the Bith had far darker motives. Secretly, Rouge's gnome was Darth Tenebrous, then the reigning Dark Lord of the Sith. As soon as he caught wind of Bal'Demnic's cortosis deposits, he and his apprentice, Darth Plagueis, travelled to the planet to investigate. Tenebrous saw their visit to the cortosis mines of Bal'Demnic as the closing of the circle of the Rule of Two, a sign that the Sith Grand Plan was about to come to fruition. 1,000 years prior, Darth Bane had made his start on the path to the dark side in a cortosis mine on Apatros, and now that the order Bane began was stronger than ever, the Sith had returned to a similar mine. Tenebrous took this to mean that great changes were on the horizon. However, he failed to foresee that the first of these changes would be his death. While the Sith Lords examined the mine, an equipment malfunction occurred, causing an explosion that partially collapsed the place. In the midst of the chaos, Darth Plagueis took advantage of the situation to kill Tenebrous, usurping the title of Dark Lord of the Sith. He left Bal'Demnic soon after, intent on preparing the final stage of the Sith Grand Plan, though not before he had a vision of the future, foreseeing a great battle that would be fought over Bal'Demnic's cortosis. Upon returning home to Munilinst, Plagueis, in his day-to-day guise as Higo Damask, a powerful figure in the intergalactic banking clan, ordered future IGBC chairman Lash Hill to purchase mining rights to as much of Bal'Demnic as he could. Hill complied, and over the course of the next few decades, secret cortosis mining operations were set up all over Bal'Demnic. Though the mines were nominally overseen by Lash Hill and then his son Sandhill, in truth they were under Sith control. Plagueis and his apprentice Darth Sidious received many shipments of cortosis from Bal'Demnic, which they put to use arming some of their agents. During the 33 BBY Yinchori uprising, for example, Sidious equipped his Yinchori agents with cortosis equipment, which they used to attack the Jedi Temple. During the Clone Wars, the intergalactic banking clan joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems and took its cortosis mines on Bal'Demnic with it. Bal'Demnic as a whole fell within separatist space and treated the Confederacy much as it had treated the Republic. It accepted the Confederacy's nominal rule so long as it didn't interfere in Kon'me affairs. But as the Clone Wars dragged on, the Confederacy began to interfere in local affairs anyway. In the final months of the war, during the Outer Rim sieges, the increasingly resource-strapped Confederacy sought to greatly expand its cortosis mining operations on Bal'Demnic. The Kon'me objected, but their leaders were eventually cowed by the threat of invasion, and new mines opened up. While the Kon'me leadership feared separatist retaliation, most of the population didn't. In 19 BBY, the Kon'me began a huge uprising using laser artillery purchased on the black market to great effect against the separatist occupiers. The CIS responded by sending in the droid army, unleashing hordes of battle droids and homing spider droids against the Kon'me cities. The Kon'me suffered heavy losses, but nonetheless persisted in the defense of their homeworld. Meanwhile, the Republic caught wind of what was happening on Bal'Demnic. Fearing that the separatist cortosis mines could be a massive problem for the Jedi, Mace Windu sent Jedi Generals Halagad Ventor and Shar Kun to the planet with an army of clone troopers. Shortly after arriving in orbit above Bal'Demnic, Republic forces quickly dispersed the separatist blockade of the planet and began landing ground forces. Ventor and Kun intended to support the Kon'me against the Confederacy, hoping to make a new ally for the Republic in the process. Instead, the appearance of yet another alien army on their planet drove the Kon'me into a state of fury. As the Republic and the Confederacy battled over Bal'Demnic's cortosis mines, the Kon'me unleashed a massive counteroffensive against both sides, making no distinction between loyalist and separatist in their assault. The Confederacy, faced with a battle on two fronts, recalled its troops from Bal'Demnic and abandoned its cortosis mines. Shortly afterwards, as Ventor and Kun had no desire to fight the Kon'me, Republic forces withdrew as well, leaving a small blockade in place to prevent further incursions. The Kon'me seemingly closed down Bal'Demnic's cortosis mines and reclaimed the land that had been taken from them by the IGBC. And as far as known galactic history is concerned, no one ever encroached Bal'Demnic again. The Kon'me were hardly the first indigenous species in galactic history to drive off a galactic superpower, but they were one of only a few to drive off two at once, a testament to their resilience and strength. Star Wars: The Clone Wars introduced us to the capital of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, a world called Raxus Secundus. But though the planet first appeared in the Clone Wars, it wasn't the first planet in the expanded universe to bear the name Raxus. Many other legend stories were set on Raxus Prime, which was confirmed to be in the same system as the new Separatist capital world. But though Raxus Secundus, as seen in the Clone Wars, seems to have been a pleasant world, Raxus Prime was anything but. In sharp contrast to its elegant neighbour, Raxus Prime was the galaxy's scrap heap, a garbage planet so thoroughly poisoned and polluted that it was hard to believe that people had once lived there. But how did these two worlds in the same system end up so sharply different? As it turns out, they have a long and colourful shared history, and in this video, we'll be diving into it. Raxus Secundus, known simply as Raxus by the time of the Clone Wars, was a temperate world of warm seas, wide grasslands, and vibrant forests. Large parts of the planet were urbanized, but the planet's cities were elegant and built in an archaic style, lending them a sense of grandeur and history. Raxus was a world renowned for its beauty and for its proud culture, which resisted assimilation into the broader culture of the Republic. It was a significant regional power in the Tython cluster, a pocket of rimworlds at the end of the Polemian trade route that, during the Clone Wars, became the heart of the CIS. Raxus Prime was a completely different story. Most of the planet was heavily industrialized, covered by vast factories that spewed poison into the atmosphere, and the parts of the planet that weren't part of any active industrial project were buried under heaps of scrap, dotted with quarry pits and toxic lagoons. The planet's few inhabitants worked in the factories and lived in sealed-off environment domes. Raxus Prime's atmosphere was breathable, but it was polluted enough to be detrimental to living beings long-term. Raxus Prime was home to far more droids than organics, as it was where most of the galaxy's defunct droids were disposed of. Millions of these junk droids still wandered the wastes, posing a threat to any trespassers on their territory. By the time of the Clone Wars, Raxus Secundus was the Raxus system's population center, while Raxus Prime was all but abandoned. But as the names of the planets suggest, this wasn't always the case. Believe it or not, Raxus Prime was once the heart of the system, a bastion of industry and political power, overshadowing its more easygoing neighbor on the galactic stage. To understand how these roles reversed, we need to go back to the beginning of the Raxus system's long history, which stretches back even before the dawn of the Republic. Between 27,500 and 25,500 BBY, the humans of Coruscant sent sleeper ships across the core worlds, seeding human civilizations across the stars. But some of these exploratory vessels strayed from their original flight paths, traveling far into the distant outer rim. These wayward colonists settled the worlds of the Tython cluster, and, in total isolation from their brethren in the core, they developed an advanced civilization. The Tynese developed primitive hyperdrive technology and energy weapons earlier than the soon-to-be Republic did, allowing them to spread out across the cluster. Unlike the other human colonies, however, which united under a democratic republic, civilization in the Tython cluster took a bit of a darker path. For most of its pre-Republic history, it was divided up between marauding pirate kings who carved out interstellar empires larger than the early Republic in the first years after the fall of the Rakatan Infinite Empire. One of these pirate kings was Xur VIII, who, from 25,150 to 25,130 BBY, united most of the Tython cluster under the Kingdom of Kon'me. It was Xur who brought the first Tynese settlers to the Raxus system, which was located on the far side of the Indrexu Spiral, a wall of nebulae rimward of the Cronies' throne worlds. Xur established the system's first settlements on Raxus Prime, where he built grand white marble palaces on the shores of lagoons floored with beautiful mosaics. Raxus Prime became one of the three capitals of the Kingdom of Kon'me and one of the most favored by Xur, who gave the planet to his concubines and their lovers when he died. Xur's favoritism made Raxus Prime one of the wealthiest worlds in the Tython cluster, and it was likely in his time that the first settlements were also established on Raxus Secundus, though very little of that planet's ancient history survives. When Xur died, he was succeeded by his son Zim, who conquered the rest of the Tython cluster and expanded his rule far beyond its borders, building the largest empire the galaxy had seen since the fall of the Rakata. For 30 years, the being history knew as Zim the Despot brought the Tython cluster to unprecedented heights, enriching Raxus and the rest of the region before he was defeated and his empire was vanquished by the neighboring Hutts. After the death of Zim, the Tython cluster fractured into several rump states, the largest of which was the honorable union of Decivro and Tython, of which the Raxus system was a part. In 24,000 BBY, the Tythonese made contact with the Republic and perceived these core worlders as naive and ripe for plundering. The Honorable Union went to war with the Republic, sparking the Republic's very first war, which the Tythonese eventually lost. After the end of the Tythonese War, the Tython cluster was annexed by the Republic, Raxus included. But the Republic conquest of the Tython cluster was incomplete. The region would be a hotbed of separatism for the rest of galactic history, and over the millennia, many independent pocket states would emerge in the region, breaking off from the Republic. One such pocket state was known as Nikato's Bootil, formed after the Third Alsacan conflict by the Machinists of Nikato, who claimed Raxus Prime as their capital. They breathed new life into the planet, making it a wealthy powerhouse once more, building elaborate clockwork structures into the ancient marble palaces. Nikato's Bootil didn't last long, but it transformed Raxus Prime forever by making it an industrial hub. The Machinists of Nikato built great factories on Raxus Prime, and once the system rejoined the Republic, these facilities were taken over by Republic corporations. Their presence on Raxus drew increasing numbers of corporations to the planet, which rapidly developed into one of the most powerful industrial worlds in the Outer Rim, known as Nikato's Shining Gem. Over the millennia, Raxus went from being a Tythonese backwater to a stronghold of the Republic, a hub of technology and innovation so important that it became a favorite target of the Sith. The Raxus system was repeatedly conquered by the Sith during the Old Sith Wars, most notably during the Great Sith War, when Raxus Prime was the site of a key battle in which the Dark Reaper, an ancient Sith superweapon, was destroyed. The Republic always returned to the planet, continuing to use it as a manufacturing hub, but Raxus Prime nonetheless suffered much over the centuries. Their suffering, however, was just a foretaste of what was to come. Over the millennia, Raxus Prime had slowly been poisoned by the very industries that gave it prominence. And during the new Sith Wars, this over-industrialization began to destabilize the planet's biosphere. The planet became increasingly less glamorous, going from Nikato's Shining Gem to a place of slag and smog that churned out crude weapons during the Dark Age of the Republic. Waste began to be dumped on the planet, crowding out the ancient palaces, destroying the art of the Tythonese and the Machinists. Entire continents were buried under piles of scrap metal, and the situation eventually became so bad that, after 1000 BBY, the very industries that had destroyed Raxus Prime began to flee the planet. The planet was never fully abandoned, and some companies continued to make use of the planet's factories, but by the time of the Clone Wars, Raxus Prime was almost entirely a junkyard. As Raxus Prime declined, however, Raxus Secundus grew in prominence. Long overshadowed by its industrialized neighbor, the natural beauty of Raxus Secundus stood in sharp contrast to the slag and smog of Raxus Prime. And during the final centuries of the Republic, it became the primary political power in the Raxus system. Raxus Secundus reached its height with the start of the Separatist Crisis, as during the 5-year reign of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, it played host to the Separatist Parliament. As capital of the Confederacy, Raxus Secundus inarguably became the dominant world of the Raxus system, with significant political influence over half the galaxy. But the significance of Raxus Prime wasn't completely lost. Count Dooku maintained a personal fortress there, and in 24 BBY, it was on Raxus Prime, not Raxus Secundus, that he delivered the Raxus Address to the galaxy, the speech with which the Confederacy of Independent Systems was formed.
Of all the civilizations in the history of the Star Wars galaxy, none were as mysterious or as powerful as the Celestials. These ancient beings had abilities beyond understanding, gods among mortals relative to the other species of the galaxy. They created entire star systems from scratch and walled off the galaxy with hyperspace anomalies before they vanished from the galaxy entirely. But they didn't leave without a trace. Indeed, they left behind many reminders of their ancient stellar engineering, including the tools they used for the job. One such artifact was Center Point Station, which the Celestials straight up abandoned in the Corellian system. In this video, we'll be telling its story. The Corellian system was itself an anomaly, baffling scientists the galaxy over for tens of thousands of years. Its central star, Corell, was orbited by 7 planets, but only 2 of them are believed to have formed with their sun, Crollia and Selonia, the outermost worlds, which were little more than barren, icy rocks on the fringe of the system. The other 5 worlds had almost perfectly circular orbits, and all of them were packed tightly into Corell's habitable zone, which led the galaxy scientists to only one conclusion. They must have originated in other systems and had somehow been dragged into Corell's orbit. 3 of the 5 habitable worlds, Corellia, Drawl, and Selonia, were fairly ordinary on their own, although Corellia's anomalous human population was believed to have been deliberately implanted by the builders of the system. But the other 2 members of the 5 brothers, as the allied Corellian worlds called themselves, were much more unusual. These planets, named Talus and Tralus, orbited each other. That may not have been terribly strange on its own. After all, in the real world, Pluto and its largest moon, Charon, actually do the same. What made Talus and Tralus unique, however, is that they were of exactly the same size and mass, meaning their gravitational barycenter was located exactly between the 2 worlds, and right at that spot sat Center Point Station. None of the Corellian system's sentient species remembered a time before Center Point. It had always sat between Talus and Tralus, rotating in sync with the double world's orbits. In the pre-Republic era, it was even colonized by humans, Selonians and Drawl, who made their homes in the station's vacant interior. None of them fully understood the nature of the station, nor did any of the many scientists who came to study their home during the long reign of the Republic. But the colonists kept living there anyway, most of them living self-sufficiently deep within the station. Politically, the Center Point Station colony was jointly supported and represented by the governments of Talus and Tralus, but the people of Center Point kept to themselves, isolated from the greater galaxy at the heart of an alien machine. By the time of the Galactic Civil War, Center Point Station's population numbered 540,000. Center Point Station was larger than the first Death Star, measuring 350 kilometers in length and 100 kilometers in height. It consisted of a spherical central structure with 2 cylindrical extensions pointing towards Talus and Tralus, each tipped with a cone. The exterior of the station was armored and covered by pipes, cables, tubes, airlocks of varying sizes, antennae, and strange cone-like structures whose purpose wasn't fully understood. Much of the station's function was unclear, but despite the vast amount of advanced technology contained within it, it somehow lacked true artificial gravity. Instead, the station rotated to maintain a gravity-like gyroscopic force. Center Point Station's decks thus ran along the outer hull of the station, and the station's inner core was always located up. The station's central sphere contained over 2,000 decks, stretching about 20 kilometers deep into the station. Some of these decks had ceilings higher than 20 meters and were called shells by the station's inhabitants. Above all 2,000 of these decks was a vast open central sphere measuring 60 kilometers in diameter, and at its very center was the station's power source, a bright glowing ball of energy appropriately named the Glow Point. The Glow Point, apart from powering the station, acted as a sort of internal sun, and because of it the inhabitants of Center Point Station were actually able to construct fields along the walls of the inner void. These fields provided food for the whole station's population, most of whom lived in communities built around the Glow Point. They referred to the vast space in which they lived as Hollow Town. At the station's poles were two vast conical arrays that rose towards the glow point, important components of the station's primary feature. The inhabitants of Hollow Town called these the North and South Conical Mountains, and many adventurers attempted to scale these peaks over the millennia. Of course, Centerpoint Station hadn't been built for habitation. Most of the station was given over to a massive network of generators and focusing chambers meant to channel a concoction of nuclear, electric, magnetic, gravitational, and hyperspatial energies into an enormous tractor beam. Centerpoint Station was an enormous and unbelievably powerful gravity generator, one that could rip planets out of orbit and pull black holes through hyperspace. Its capabilities were never fully understood until the Galactic Civil War, nor was the sheer magnitude of what it could do. Centerpoint Station could build star systems, or create massive gravitational fluxes that could cause planets on the other side of the galaxy to implode. In the years after the Yuuzhan Vong War, the new Jedi Order learned that the Centerpoint Station had been indeed commissioned by the Celestials, and they also discovered that it had been built by the Killiks, a hive-minded species that had evolved on Alderaan but had vanished into the unknown regions millennia before the foundation of the Republic. The Killiks told the Jedi that they had been recruited to build the station, which they called the World Puller, by the son and the daughter. Yes, that son and that daughter. And that the station had been used not only to build the Corellian system, but also to imprison one of their own on a world deep in the Outer Rim. By the time the Jedi discovered Centerpoint's purpose, however, the station had already been destroyed. That was because, a little over 20 years earlier, a group of unsavory individuals known as the Secundus Triad had figured out how to get the station working again. In a bid to seize control of the Corellian sector and get it to secede from the New Republic, the Triad started using its gravitational power to blow up stars, sparking the Corellian crisis. They blew up the uninhabited star TD10036 EM1271 as a test, and then blew up Phantazilbra, the sun of an inhabited planet. The Triad tried to hit another star, Bovo Yagan, but they were defeated by the Jedi. In firing Centerpoint Station, the Triad had not only killed everyone in an entire star system, but they had also inadvertently wiped out Hollow Town too. When the station was fired, the glow point flared and incinerated everything within its chamber, killing untold thousands of people. This wasn't the last time the Centerpoint was fired either. During the Yuuzhan Vong War, Thraken Sal Solo used it to blow up a Vong fleet, though he accidentally also wiped out an allied Hapan fleet in the process. The station was also used during the Second Galactic Civil War, during which the Jedi finally decided that enough was enough and engineered the destruction of the entire station. But this, it turned out, was a bit of a mistake. Centerpoint Station, as the Killiks later told the Jedi, wasn't just a weapon, and it hadn't only been used to build the Corellian system. When the Killiks had left the station for the unknown regions, they had left it active, setting it to continuously stabilize the original construct the Ones had used it to build. This construct was the Maw, a cluster of black holes near the Kessel system, which Centerpoint Station had worked in conjunction with the similarly designed but smaller Sinkhole Station to build. The two stations had continued to work in tandem, the sinkhole from inside the Maw and the Centerpoint from the outside, keeping the black holes in perfect alignment. But when Centerpoint Station was destroyed, Sinkhole Station began to malfunction and the black holes of the Maw began to drift. When they did, an ancient evil was unleashed, something far worse than the Jedi could ever have imagined. For at the heart of the Maw lay a lone planet, which the son and the daughter had turned into a prison. This prison was home to Abeloth, the Mother, the embodiment of chaos itself. In destroying Centerpoint Station, the Jedi had probably saved lives, but they ended up opening an even more perilous can of worms in the process.
To the uninitiated, the Tarkans might have appeared to have been core worlders, They had the accent, and they certainly had the sense of superiority to fit the bill. But their homeworld, Eriadu, was actually located in the Outer Rim, much to the chagrin of its people. Eriadu wasn't like most Rimworlds, however. It was known as the Coruscant of the Outer Rim, and its proud people compensated for their homeworld's location by being more core than the core. Their homeworld was heavily urbanized and wealthy, a planet with a longer history than most Rimworlds, and not a pleasant one either. Eriadu was located at the heart of the Outer Rim's Seswena system, in the 4th orbital position around its star. It was a fairly standard planet, terrestrial with a breathable atmosphere, standard gravity, and a single moon. Its environment had once been pleasant, with lush, forested continents, warm seas, and beautiful seashores. But by the time of the Clone Wars, Eriadu's natural beauty had long since been destroyed, replaced by urban sprawl. Huge vertical cities dominated large parts of the planet, while the rest of Eriadu was covered by industrial zones and waste zones. Extractive industries operated without restriction, poisoning the planet's seas and continents, and its atmosphere was choked with industrial waste, which gave its sky an orange haze. While most industrialized planets made use of water purifiers, atmospheric scrubbers, and other advanced waste disposal systems, such technologies were absent on Eriadu, which had long ago been irreparably poisoned by reckless industrialization, killing virtually all of the planet's native animal species. But Eriadu was nonetheless a wealthy world. It sat at the crossroads of several major hyperspace routes, which gave it a stranglehold over trade in the southern rim. The Hydian Way and Rumor trade route met at Eriadu, and the Lipsec Run, Yankirk route, and Nothoian corridor also passed through the Eriadu system. And its vast urban zones were incredibly productive, producing manufactured goods, computer parts, droids, and textiles, while orbital shipyards built starships, including warships. The largest corporation on the planet, Eriadu Manufacturing, employed a sizable chunk of the planet's 22 billion inhabitants, the vast majority of whom were human. All told, Eriadu was a productive industrial world, if also a miserable cesspit. Its capital was Eriadu City, located in the planet's southern hemisphere. The only thing more miserable than Eriadu's environment was its culture. Eriaduan society was strictly hierarchical and wildly unequal, with those at the top believing themselves superior to those below them. The planet was ruled by an oligarchy of 5 aristocratic families called the Quintad, whose arrogance and self-importance was unrivaled across the entire galaxy. The vast majority of Eriadu's wealth and political power was concentrated in their hands. Humanocentrism was rampant on Eriadu, which liked to frame itself as a bastion of civilization in the wild, alien Outer Rim, and even during the time of the Republic, Eriadu had a population of around 3 billion slaves. The title of Coruscant of the Outer Rim really doesn't go far enough in describing Eriadu. The planet embodied everything wrong with the galactic capital without any of the good. Eriadu was a late addition to the Republic, having only been discovered sometime around 5000 BBY. Once, it was a fairly unremarkable world, known mostly for the production of jewelry made from the shells of Eriadu and flow mollusks. It did have some industry. During the Jedi Civil War, for example, it made stealth generators and strength gauntlets, but this was mostly small scale for most of the planet's early history. As more trade routes began to pop up in the galaxy's southern region, Eriadu started to see more traffic, but it wasn't until the arrival of the Quintad in 900 BBY that Eriadu became the Coruscant of the Outer Rim. The Quintad were 5 wealthy families, originally from Korulag, one of the oldest of the core worlds. They came to Eriadu looking to build up a manufacturing hub in the Outer Rim, and under their rule, the planet transformed, becoming the polluted industrial titan we're familiar with. This made the Quintad extremely wealthy, particularly the most powerful and ruthless of the 5 families, the Tarkans. The Tarkans dominated Eriadu by the time of the Separatist Crisis, earning positions of power in both the Seswena sector and the wider Republic. Starting around 57 BBY, the patriarch of the family, Governor General Randolph Tarkin, began seeking to expand Eriadu's military power. Tarkin was frustrated with the abundance of piracy as well as the growing power of non-human civilizations in the Outer Rim, and he blamed this state of lawlessness on the Republic's lack of a centralized military. Tarkin was an early member of the Republic's militarist political faction, but unlike most militarists, the bulk of whom were specious politicians that did little more than whine on the holonet, Tarkin decided to take action. Under his command, the Seswenna Defense Forces began a massive military build-up using lend-lease agreements with foreign shipbuilders to get around the Ruusan Reformation's limits on fleet size. Then Tarkin began reaching out to the sectors surrounding Seswenna, many of which were impoverished backwaters, offering them economic assistance if they agreed to combine their military forces. In this manner, Randolph Tarkin created the Republic Outlands Region Security Force, a shared military force to patrol what Tarkin called the Greater Seswenna, a large theatre of operations that covered much of the southern rim. Ostensibly, the Outland Region's security force was a simple mutual defense project, but anyone with half a brain could see that that wasn't true. The ORSF was completely dominated by the Tarkins and was used to enforce Eriaduan interests, with the Seswenna's neighbouring sectors forced into contributing to the project by what amounted to neo-colonial trade agreements. That the ORSF only recruited humans and referred to its theatre of operations as the Greater Seswenna only made this clearer. Some of the Republic's saner senators called Tarkin out on this, and in response, he resigned from the position of Governor General in 54 BBY, passing the position to his cousin, Garvadon. Tarkin instead became Eriadu's senator, a position he used to argue for militarist policy in the Senate. In 44 BBY, the ORSF saw its first real battle with the outbreak of the Stark Hyperspace War, but this first outing proved disastrous and Randolph Tarkin was killed in the fighting. This dealt a major blow to the project, but only for a short time. Just 2 decades later, the Clone Wars erupted and the militarists' dreams were realized with the establishment of the Grand Army of the Republic. The ORSF was merged into the 18th Sector Army, which was headquartered on Eriadu, with the Greater Seswenna becoming the 18th Army's oversector. During the war, Eriadu was pretty much the only loyalist stronghold on the Rimmer trade route, and it fought a constant back and forth war with its neighbours, eventually retaking Selust and much of the Rimmer by the time of the Outer Rim sieges. 2 Tarkins were anointed heroes of the Republic during the Clone Wars: Brigadier General Gideon Tarkin, who commanded Republic forces in the Greater Seswenna, and Admiral Wilhof Tarkin, who later became the Oversector's Moff. After the end of the Clone Wars, Eriadu became an Imperial stronghold, and Moff Tarkin became an increasingly powerful figure in the new Empire. Early in the Imperial period, Tarkin was promoted to Grand Moff, the first person to hold the title, and he was given command of Oversector Outer, which covered the entire Outer Rim. Tarkin oversaw the imperialization of the Outer Rim from Eriadu, and under the Empire, the planet became even wealthier due to its status as one of the Imperial Navy's primary shipyards. But Eriadu's fortunes took a turn after Tarkin was killed aboard the first Death Star in the Battle of Yavin. Command of Oversector Outer passed to Grand Moff Ardus Kane, who relocated the Oversector's headquarters from Eriadu to Entrala on the opposite side of the galaxy. This cost Eriadu some prestige, but not all. Furthermore, some of the Oversector Outer's command personnel refused to relocate and continued to prioritize defense of the Greater Seswenna. These were led by Admiral Sander Delvedus, who had married into the Tarkin family. After the Battle of Endor, Admiral Delvedus promoted himself to the rank of Superior General and proclaimed himself the warlord of the Eriadu Authority, an imperial splinter state that controlled the Seswenna sector, several of its neighbours, and much of the Rimmer trade route. The Eriadu Authority promptly became one of the primary targets of the New Republic, which retook the Rimmer and dealt Delvedus a string of serious defeats at Selust, Sluis Van, and half a dozen other key Eriadu Authority worlds. The Eriadu Authority endured, and the Seswenna sector remained under Imperial control for years afterwards, but it was greatly reduced in power and scope, and the campaign caused Delvedus to fall out of favour with the Quintad, leading to years of squabbles between the 5 families and the warlords that eventually caused the Eriadu Authority to crumble. Delvedus and the Imperial forces loyal to him bled to the deep core, and in their absence, Eriadu caved to economic pressure and joined the New Republic. Under the New Republic, slavery was abolished on Eriadu, though the planet remained a key local economic power. Eriadu escaped the horrors of the Yuuzhan Vong War and became very prestigious because of this in the years afterwards. Superior General Delvedus, meanwhile, hit out on camp in the deep core with what remained of the Eriadu authority, pouring what resources he had left into the construction of the Executor-class star dreadnought Night Hammer. He re-emerged after Palpatine's return to ravage the core world Metalos, but after the reborn Palpatine's final demise, he was driven back to the deep core. He and a dozen other Imperial warlords were killed at Tassos Beacon by Admiral Natasi Dala in 12 ABY, following which Dala seized control of his forces, including the Night Hammer, and consolidated them in the hands of the sole remaining Imperial remnant, which, ironically enough, was originally based at Grand Moff Kane's stronghold of Introlla. Star Wars was full of proud civilizations that were independent from galactic society to some degree or another. These ranged from relatively small, semi-independent systems like Dathomir to much larger swaths of territory, such as Hutt Space. One of the more lesser-known independent civilizations was the Hapes Consortium, a sector which, despite being located fairly close to major hyperroutes and the heart of the core worlds, maintained a fierce independence from the Republic and Empire alike. Considered an allied region by both governments, the Hapes Consortium was a rigidly matriarchal society that maintained a closed border policy with the outside galaxy, and in this video, we'll be providing an in-depth look at its history and culture. The story of the Hapes Consortium begins with the Laurel Raiders, a notorious and highly organized group of pirates that plagued the Inner Rim throughout the post-Mandarin period. Originating from Laurel and the Trellan trade routes, these pirates struck shipping vessels and passenger ships alike, and they were notorious for kidnapping women from the ships they raided. They hid their captives on their most well-guarded stronghold, the planet Hapes, a world hidden deep in a tangle of nebulae off the Polemian trade routes. These nebulae walled off an entire star cluster from the outside galaxy, making hyperspace travel impossible in all but a few spots. The whole cluster was a natural fortress, and the Laurel Raiders made extensive use of it. Over the centuries, the Raiders' captives on Hapes steadily became their own distinct people. Due to a limited genetic pool, the Hapans also rapidly adapted to their new homeworld. Due to the sheer density of stars in the cluster and its 7 moons, Hapes never saw true light, and as a result, the Hapans quickly lost their night vision, a minor quirk that nonetheless set them apart from baseline humans. Generations of women lived and died on Hapes without ever leaving the planet. Their sons were typically taken by pirates and trained to join the Raiders. Then, in 4030 BBY, the Jedi Knights came knocking. After many years of battling the Laurel Raiders, the Republic had finally figured out the hyperspace routes to Hapes, and the Jedi amassed a task force to cleanse the Inner Rim of its pirate scourge. They completely annihilated the Laurel Raiders, and when all was said and done, the Jedi convinced the Republic to leave Hapes and the surrounding Hapes cluster to the Raiders' now freed captives, who quickly built a civilization of their own. After the defeats of the Laurel Raiders, the surviving Hapan population were mostly women, and they were all determined to never again be ruled by men. They established a hereditary monarchy, the Hapes Consortium, led by a queen mother, and from Hapes they rapidly spread out across the cluster they called home. After roughly a millennia of expansion and independent development, during which they settled 63 worlds in the cluster and were recognized as an allied region by the Republic, the Hapans closed themselves off from the galaxy in 3100 BBY, barring travelers from entering the Hapes cluster, with only a few rare exceptions. Very little is known of Hapan history during the cluster's 3 millennia period of isolation, so we're going to pause here and discuss the astrography of the Hapes cluster itself. Large parts of the Hapes cluster were inaccessible due to the presence of transitory mists, great nebulae of dust and gas that produced the cluster's many stars. There were believed to be as many as 190 potentially habitable worlds among those stars, though the Hapans only settled 63 systems, most of them close to the cluster's heart. There were only 2 routes through the outer nebulae, which divided the cluster from the rest of the galaxy. The Hapan Spine, which led out to Tanab on the Polemian Run, and the more obscure Lorel routes, which led out to Lorel. The Hapan Spine was by far the most widely used route, so we'll start our tour of the cluster there. Along the Hapan Spine was Rokwo Depot, which was a sort of border crossing point for the Hapes cluster. Beyond lay the Hapan Rim Worlds, a corridor of systems that was cut off from the cluster's heart by a thick tendril of the transitory mists, which inhibited communication between Hapes and these colonies. As a result, the Rim Worlds were considered backwaters, connected to the rest of Hapan civilization only by the Great Rim Route. Planets in this region included Orelon, Rainbow, Rinmar, Zalori, Terraphon, Shedu, Mard, Rebome, Drenna, Kalfa 5, and Kafari. Of these, the only notable worlds were Terraphon, the backwater homeworld of a clan of Hapan royal guards, and Shedu Mard, which was the temporary home of the New Jedi Order at one point. Just beyond the Rim Worlds was a small region called the Corsair Outback, which contained the Joraka, Stalsenek, and Nantaka systems. The Laurel route emptied out in a pocket of the cluster known as the Lorelli Reach, home to Ket, Daruvia, Senix, Andalia, Chospa, and Telka Station, the latter of which was located in a region known as the Knotholes. Both the Lorel route and the Great Rim route led into the Rifle Worlds, the Hapes cluster's industrial and commercial heart, which were named after an attempt at secession they made early in the consortium's history. The Rifle Worlds included Lavola, Meres, Virgil, and Modus along the Lorel route, Devora, Woden, Algnadesh, and Relifon along the Great Rim routes, and Charuba and Charuba along the Galanor Reach, which led into the heart of the cluster. Adjacent to the Rifle Worlds were the Gate Worlds, which were Sargon, Fabrini, Zadaria, and Felope, all along the Rinmar Trail, which led to Hapes. The heart of the Hapes cluster was appropriately called the Interior Region, and it was home to roughly 24 of the cluster's most prestigious worlds. These were Tal Sharaim, Savoia, Farnica, Novi, Galanor, Baldavia, Thessalon, Milenar, Lamayash, Arches, Selab, Javaria, Lemimi, Thracia, Hatera Uts, Rebella, Tzirata, Tumani, Ediorung, Kalania, Arabanth, and, of course, Hapes itself. Hapes was by far the most important world of any of these, but it was nonetheless mostly unspoiled, with its population of only 100 million, all living in a select few cities. The Hapans were sticklers for protecting what they considered beautiful, and so they took special care to preserve Hapes' environment. As a result, Hapes was renowned for its natural beauty, especially at night, when its sky lit up with the light of 7 moons, the bright tendrils of the transitory mists, and the countless stars of the Hapes cluster. Unfortunately, the beauty of Hapes and the surrounding cluster was somewhat tainted by the Hapes consortium's absolutely merciless political climate. The consortium featured high economic inequality, and members of higher social and economic classes tended to look down on those lower in the totem pole than themselves, often seeing their lower standing as a moral failing or an expression of some inherent inferiority. The consortium was also a pure aristocracy, with all the corruption and intrigue at the top that entails. Assassination was the primary method of social advancement for members of the Hapan ruling class, and the Queen Mothers were known to arrange for the deaths of cousins, and sometimes even their own children. As we mentioned earlier, Hapes was also a strict matriarchy. The Hapans had started out just being unwilling to ever again be ruled by men, but they eventually came to believe that men were outright biologically inferior, incapable of being as intelligent as women. The Hapans used this notion as the basis for making all males second-class citizens within the Hapes consortium, to the point where many male Hapans joined pirate gangs or smuggled themselves out of the sector to escape it. There were examples of men, usually from the royal family, who were afforded minor positions of power, such as Prince Isildur, who we'll talk about later, but these were few and far between, and they were usually supervised by higher-ranking women. Rampant inequality aside, the Hapans also had some pretty cool starships, which the Hapan Royal Navy used to defend the cluster's borders. Due to millennia spent isolated from the galaxy, the Hapan's technology was inferior to the Republic/Imperial standard in some ways, and superior in others. Their turbo lasers, for instance, were inaccurate and required long cooldown times after each shot, while their ion cannons were better than any equivalent the Empire ever developed. The cluster's warships and starfighters were primarily produced by Olangi/Charuba, and only a few are known by name. In the Imperial era, the Hapans' primary space superiority fighter was the Mid-Till Starfighter, a unique craft that vaguely resembled the Sith fighters employed by Revan's Sith Empire. Designed with help from separatist shipwrights that sought refuge in the sector after the Clone Wars, these craft were fast as hell, featured onboard astromechs, and were armed with 2 laser cannons and a concussion missile launcher. They were primarily carried aboard Nova-class battle cruisers, which sort of resemble Klingon birds of prey and were the backbone of the Royal Navy. At 400 meters long, these ships required crews of nearly 2,000 each, and they sported 25 turbo laser batteries, 10 ion cannons, 10 heavy point defense laser cannons, and hangars with room for 30 starfighters. The symbols of the Hapan fleet, however, were the iconic Hapan battle dragons. These ships kind of look like classic Cylon base stars, but there's really nothing like these double-saucered battleships which Imperial commanders rightly feared. The 2 saucer-like main sections of the Hapan battle dragons were connected by narrow pylons and ringed with weaponry. These guys were nearly twice the size of Nova-class battlecruisers, but they actually required several hundred fewer crew. At the same time, they could carry 36 starfighters and a complement of up to 500 ground troops, and they were armed with 40 turbo laser batteries, 40 ion cannons, a pair of triple ion cannons, 10 proton torpedo launchers, a tractor beam projector, and 16 pulse mass generators, which essentially fired hyperspace interdiction mines. But what made the design of the Hapan battle dragon so ingenious was how it accounted for the weaknesses of its turbo lasers. In battle, Hapan battle dragons constantly rotated, much like the aforementioned Cylon base stars, which allowed fresh turbo lasers to be brought to bear, while recently used ones were allowed to cool. These ships rarely saw full-scale battles, however, due to the Hapes Consortium's isolation. As we mentioned earlier, Hapes remained cut off from the greater galaxy for 3,000 years of Republic history, and it maintained that isolation through the Imperial era. If you're surprised that the Empire allowed the Hapes cluster to maintain its independence, you're not alone. It was a mystery to most of the galaxy as well. There were a few minor clashes between Hapan forces and Imperial fleets, but these were usually staged by Emperor Palpatine, who used the Hapans to kill off high-ranking commanders who displeased him. By and large, Hapes and the Empire were on surprisingly good terms for no apparent reason, leading many to speculate that the Emperor was sleeping with the Hapan Queen Mother or some other aristocrat. These allegations were totally unproven, it should be noted, but it's a spicy bit of trivia nonetheless. The Hapans didn't open up to the greater galaxy until 8 ABY, when, with no warning, they reached out to the New Republic, which had taken Coruscant from the Empire the year before. The reason? Crown Prince Isildur wanted to marry Princess Leia, and his mother, the Queen Mother, hoped such a marriage would considerably increase Hapes' political influence. This situation was a whole confusing knot of sketchy politics. If you want the whole story, read The Courtship of Princess Leia, the 1994 Legends novel this story comes from, which first introduced the Hapans. To make a long story short though, Leia eventually decided to marry Han Solo instead, and Isildur ended up marrying a witch from Dathomir, which was annexed by the Hapes Consortium due to the cultural compatibility of the 2 matriarchal societies. Leia and Isildur remained on friendly terms though, and so the Hapes cluster ended up opening up to the New Republic anyway. The Hapans were pretty heavily involved with the Yuuzhan Vong War and the events of the later post-Endor years, but that's a story in itself, so we're going to wrap things up here.
There are many planets in Star Wars with a history so influential that had they never existed, it would have altered the course of galactic history. Many come to mind easily. Coruscant for one, and the other core worlds were critical in the foundation of the Galactic Republic, but another, more obscure world comes to mind too. Tython, the birthplace of the Jedi Order. Few planets went through quite the roller coaster Tython did, and in today's video, we're going to take a look at its turbulent history that shaped the galaxy as we know it today. In many ways, Tython was a very pleasant planet. Located in the Tython system of the deep core, it was essentially very Earth-like. It had a breathable atmosphere, lush forests, mountains, grasslands, and plenty of surface water in the forms of oceans and lakes. It also had 2 moons, named Ashla and Bogan. And if those names sound familiar, it's because they are. But we'll get to them in a second. By all definitions, it was a wonderful place to live on. But it was more than just a jewel of a planet. You see, Tython was incredibly strong in the Force, and that was probably the reason why it attracted so much attention. Its early history is mostly shrouded in mystery. We know an ancient civilization lived there tens of thousands of years before 40,000 BBY, as they constructed a structure known only as the Old City. By the time the Glee visited, the first known people after the Celestials to develop interstellar travel, that first civilization was long gone. After the Glee had inhabited Tython for a brief time, it was also visited by the Qua, but they died out after destroying the local Infinity Gate in order to protect the region from the Rakata's march throughout the galaxy. With that early history out of the way, we get to the really juicy bits of Tython's lore. In 36453 BBY, the first Force-sensitive pilgrims came to Tython in what came to be called the First Migration. The pilgrims were brought to the planet in the Tho-Yor, 8 giant pyramid-shaped ships the Illuminati would be jealous of. The arrival of so many Force sensitives caused an intense Force storm to rage as the 8 ships met the 9th and largest Tho-Yor above a huge rocky formation before scattering to 8 different corners of the world. After the pilgrims finally disembarked from their pointy ships, they built cities and became the new Tythons. Together, the pilgrims began studying the Force and formed a common philosophy as they uncovered more and more secrets. They realized that there was a need for balance in the Force. Every time an imbalance occurred, the planets reacted with quakes and storms. Remember the 2 moons we mentioned earlier? Ashla was a bright satellite, while Bogan was darker. These 2 moons became the inspiration for what was eventually called the light side and the dark side. Gradually, the pilgrims founded the Jedi Order, the precursor to both the Jedi and Sith orders. The name was taken from the Talid language and meant Mystic Center. The new Jedi Order constructed 9 temples, one where each of the Tho-Yor ships had landed. The first of these temples was called Padawan Kesh, the first ever Jedi Academy. After the other 8 were constructed, a tradition was born. Young Jedi who had completed their time as Padawans at the Academy became Jedi Journeyers and were tasked to undergo a 2-year pilgrimage across all 8 temples. This was called the Great Journey, and it was an essential part of a young Jedi's progression in the Order. For the first 1,000 years of the Jedi Order, things were mostly peaceful. During this time, the planet was racked with countless Force storms, as the pilgrims hadn't yet learned how to restore balance to the Force. During the second millennium, however, after the destruction of the city of Orum, the pilgrims realized that non-Force sensitives couldn't survive on the planet. In what was called the Second Migration, non-Jedi left Tython for other planets in the sector, colonizing them. From then on, any Force sensitives born on the settled worlds, as they were called, were sent to Tython to be trained as Jedi. For 10,000 years, this continued. However, as you can imagine, when one planet is the center of attention, the other planets in the system eventually grew resentful of the Jedi. In 25805 BBY, the despot Queen Hadiyah gathered the crime barons of her homeworld and conquered the rest of the settled worlds before her army invaded Tython. Thousands on both sides died during that battle until Hadiyah was slain by the Jedi Dagon Locke, ending the despot wars. But peace was never an option. Less than 50 years after the Despot Wars, a brutal civil war broke out on Tython between those who favored Ashla and those who favored Bogan. The Force Wars, as they came to be known, were essentially the first fight between Lightsiders and Darksiders, seeing Jedi cutting each other down with Force-imbued katana. At the time, the followers of Ashla called themselves the Jedi Order and were governed by a high council. Master Rajivary had been one of them, but he had become corrupted by the dark side. He had led a faction of Bogan followers to turn on the Jedi. He and his followers chose the Temple of Knowledge, known as Kaleth, as their headquarters, and fought the Jedi from there. Before the conflict was resolved, however, Rajivary disappeared, leaving his followers to fall without his leadership. This might have ended the first conflict between light and dark, but it was only the beginning. For a while, the Jedi were happy on Tython. Remember how we said the planet was very rich in the Force? At the time, the Jedi believed their powers were limited to Tython only. But, right after the end of the Force Wars, a group of Jedi calling themselves the Jedi Knights left the planet to liberate other worlds. When they realized they were equally overpowered off-world, the Jedi chose to move their headquarters from Tython to Ascendancy. Tython faded into obscurity. In 3996 BBY, Ascendancy was destroyed during the Great Sith Wars, leaving the Jedi Order homeless. Instead of returning to Tython, however, they set up shop on Coruscant, a few clicks away from the Senate Tower. At the time, there were still records of Tython, but those records showed Sith spawn had been let loose on the planet. These creatures, called Terentatex, were the result of Sith alchemy. The Jedi High Council wasn't a huge fan of these abominations that were springing up all over the galaxy, and so they sent Jedi out to hunt them down. Tython itself was cleansed in 3994 BBY, but the Jedi didn't feel like relocating yet again. Not long after, hyperlanes to the planet collapsed, and Tython was cut off and abandoned, but not forgotten. Fans of our Sith history series may remember the Great Galactic War, which ended with the Treaty of Coruscant. During that climactic battle and the occupation of Coruscant, the Sith bombed the stuffing out of the Jedi Temple. With no other choice, the Jedi Order needed a new home. In 3651 BBY, Jedi Knight Satil Shan paved new lanes to Tython and re-established the Jedi Order there. A new Jedi Temple was erected, but it didn't see much peace. Within the next 30 years, the Jedi Temple was bombed by Revanites, invaded by Sith, and left abandoned once the Eternal Empire invaded the galaxy and scattered the few Jedi that survived the Zakul Wars. When the Jedi eventually began pulling themselves together again, they chose to resettle on a different world, one less isolated. Tython was left alone once more for a long time. Its next occupants weren't as cheery as the Jedi had been. Sometime after the Zakul Wars, Tython suffered a great catastrophe we know nothing about. What we do know is that, in its aftermath, the planet became shrouded in dark side energy. When the new Sith Wars were raging, this made the planet a very tempting location for a Sith fortress, which is exactly what it ended up becoming. The Shaido Sith Lord Belia Darzu, whom you might recognize as the lovely lady who built the Techno Beasts from a past video, settled on Tython and erected a huge fortress. There, she developed her skills through twisted experiments until she perfected her Sith abominations in 1250 BBY. After unleashing a wave of them on the galaxy, ushering in the new Sith Wars phase known as the Sictus Wars, she pissed off the Merkosa Order, who had her assassinated in her fortress. Following what must be a familiar cycle by now, Tython was abandoned when the hyperlanes were lost, until the Sith aspirant Heton rediscovered how to get there in 990 BBY. He passed this information on to Darth Zana, who was still an apprentice to Darth Bane, the Dark Lord of the Sith at the time. Bane traveled to Tython so he could learn more about Darzu's research from her holocron. Once he arrived on the planet, Darzu's fortress defenses attacked him, but he overcame them. Once inside, he came face to face with an army of hibernating techno-beasts, which attacked him too, when he tried to make off with Darzu's holocron. After escaping, Bane chilled somewhere on the planet, studying the holocron so he could learn to make his own. While Bane had gone to Tython, Zana had traveled to Tython to raid the archives of the Jedi Temple. However, she was discovered and had to flee to Tython with her cousin, Daravit. Fans familiar with the story, or those who watched our video on Darth Bane, know the Jedi pursued them to Tython, and a fight broke out between the two sides. 5 Jedi fought the 2 Sith in Darzu's fortress, resulting in a Sith victory. After Bane and Zana left, the Jedi established an academy on the planet, despite it still being heavily polluted by the dark side. This academy functioned as an area to study the Force in deeper immersion, though it's our personal opinion that this was a very bad idea. For a long time, Tython fell out of relevance. During the Separatist crisis, the rumor mill spit out several conspiracies about the planet known to be the birthplace of the Jedi. As public opinion of the Order steadily soured, many started talking about a secret temple on Tython filled with riches beyond measure. Despite these rumors, however, Tython would eventually be lost to time and memory. For a planet that was the birthplace of the Jedi and a stronghold of the Sith, Tython really lost its significance after the Great Galactic War. Even then, the planet was a bastion of the Order for over 20,000 years, leading us to claim it as the most important planet in Jedi history.
Whether you're a fan of the older content or excited for the new stuff, something all fans can agree on is that Star Wars has incredible world building. Disregarding how many times we still manage to end up on Tatooine, the sheer number and variety of different planets in the galaxy makes the universe feel more real. From overgrown volcanic worlds like Belsavis to frozen balls of ice like Ilum, there's truly something for everyone out there. One of our personal favorite kinds of planet are the ocean worlds like Kamino or Manaan. There's something truly alien about a world covered in water, and much like with our own oceans, there's just no telling what might be lurking beneath the waves. In this video, we'll be talking about one such planet, Glee Anselm, a world with 2 very different species, some of which made very questionable life choices. Located in the Jalor sector of the Mid-Rim, Glee Anselm was an ocean world with almost no land masses. Once upon a time, the planet had had continents of its own, but they had all sunk to the ocean floor over 4,000 years ago. The few bits of dry land that were left took the shape of small islands covered in various biomes, from beachy jungles to mountains to grasslands. The planet experienced fairly intense weather changes, with storms that often reached cyclonic proportions. Despite that, it was still considered beautiful enough for companies like Star Tours to host tours across it. The ocean itself was deep and dark, but civilization didn't stop just because light did. You see, the planet was home to 2 native sentient species, the Nautilans and the Anselmi, who were at odds with one another. The Nautilans, on the one hand, inhabited the planet's oceans deep within the aphotic zone. The Anselmi, on the other hand, built their civilization atop the world's landmasses. Despite how close they lived and developed with one another, the 2 cultures couldn't be more different. On the one hand, the Anselmi were a blue-skinned humanoid species with 4-fingered hands and 3-toed feet. Unlike their neighbours, the tops of their heads were bald save for 2 thin antennae. They also sported a thin tail that might once have been an evolutionary adaptation for swimming. Once, the Anselmi had lived underwater, just like the Nautilans. However, due to their warlike nature, they found coexistence with their neighbours impossible. The Anselmi had a bad habit of raiding them, stealing resources that the Nautilans were happy to share anyway. Tensions kept rising, so gradually the Anselmi moved to the land, hoping to avoid open war with the Nautilans. Over time, they lost their ability to breathe underwater until they were exclusively land dwellers. Even after leaving the ocean behind them, they approached life with the same greedy, can-do attitude. When life gave them ocean, they said nah and built dams to drive back the waters and create more land for their use. They built up industry that leaked pollutants into the ocean and, as the Nautilans would say, lived a very disharmonious life. On the other hand, the Nautilans were completely different. Initially, they had inhabited dark underwater caves, eventually evolving to build communities centered around their families and run by their elders. Where the Anselmi had embraced the way of the land, the Nautilans thrived on the dark ocean floor. Not only could they breathe underwater as easily as they did air,
but they had other evolutionary adaptations to make life under the sea just a little bit easier. Like with other amphibians, their skin had adapted to being constantly surrounded by water, and their exoskeletons and dense cartilage meant the intense water pressure didn't just squish them into an amphibious paste. Webbed hands and toes helped them swim, and their large, liquid eyes were capable of catching even the tiniest mote of light. Even then, they didn't need sight to communicate. Nautilans were able to sense the emotions of others around them. In the oceans of Glee and Anselm, this was done through their head tentacles, which could scent chemicals in the water that other beings gave off, such as pheromones. That made communicating with one another almost telepathic, which is great when you can't see or speak to one another. Now, these two sentient species had more in contrast than just their chosen habitat. Their main quarrel was in the way they perceived their environment. While the Anselmi built great civilizations, allowing refuse to pour into the ocean and keeping nature back by building dams, the Nautilans believed in being in harmony with nature around you. And on Glee and Anselm, that was synonymous with being one with the ocean. The Nautilans believed in something they called the ocean spirit and did their best to be respectful of their home and one another. They disliked conflict in all shape and form and prioritized being kind and generous, not just to each other, but also their neighbors. Even when the Anselmi polluted their ocean and raided them, the Nautilans were generous with their resources and advice. They cautioned the Anselmi that the way they were living went against the will of the ocean spirit, which would only lead to disaster. The Anselmi didn't heed their warning, but perhaps they should have. Around 4,000 years before the fall of the Republic, a great storm hit the Anselmi Empire, resulting in the vast majority of their land sinking beneath the waves. To the Nautilans, this was divine justice, but to the Anselmi, this spelled disaster for their people. As you might expect from the whole landmasses sinking to the ocean floor bit, the Anselmi took a rather hard hit. Their civilization almost broke overnight. Where they had once vast swaths of land to live off, now their population was left with very little. The cyclone-level weather patterns we mentioned earlier certainly didn't help them stabilize after the catastrophe, and as time passed, the competition for food and resources drove them back toward a more primitive society. This created a noticeable disparity between the two populations. As the Anselmi diminished, the Nautilans' population only grew until they represented most of the planet's population. Naturally, this bred resentment from the Anselmi's side, but surprisingly, this resentment didn't explode into conflict as it had on other planets. When the Clone Wars broke out in 22 BBY, both peoples of Glee and Anselm were staunchly on the side of the Republic. In fact, at this time, the ocean world was represented in the Galactic Senate by a male Anselmi named Darsana. The world was so loyalist that, with the outbreak of war, Darsana was appointed to the Loyalist Committee. This committee was put together by Chancellor Palpatine himself, and of the thousands of worlds that made up the Galactic Republic, only 10 were selected to be on the committee. Among other worlds like Alderaan and Naboo, who had an obvious place at the heart of Republic politics, the humble Glee Anselm found its place. Palpatine created the committee in an effort to root out separatist sympathizers present in the Senate and promote loyalty to the Republic. But many saw it as a shadow government Palpatine was using to avoid passing legislation such as the Military Creation Act. That said, as the Clone Wars progressed, the members of the committee took more and more issue with Palpatine's reformations, suggesting perhaps that Palpatine had really created the body to keep a closer eye on his enemies. Sadly, we can say for sure that, despite Glee Anselm's loyalty to the Republic, the planet proved it wasn't loyal to the Republic's ideals, but to the general concept of a centralized power. After the declaration of a new order, Glee Anselm transitioned smoothly into being fiercely loyal to the Galactic Empire. In the end, what it proved was that being fiercely loyal to something isn't necessarily a good thing. If one's loyalty is easily transferred over to something or someone else that represents the polar opposite of what you had once believed in, then it was never really loyalty to begin with.
Throughout galactic history, The philosophies and lives of the Jedi and Sith orders were what dictated the balance of the galaxy. These orders were so influential and connected to vast empires that to many civilians, they were the poster children for the term Force users. But the galaxy was a vast place, and in the grand scheme of things, the Jedi and the Sith were insignificant. There were countless Force-sensitive civilizations, each with their own history and philosophy on the Force. In today's video, we'll be looking at the Voss, a planet, species, and culture that was so different from any generic Force user that it made every outsider to their world confused. But before we start talking about the Voss and their many quirks, we need to first look at the place that shaped their beliefs. Voss, the planet. Located in the allied Tython sector of the Outer Rim, Voss was the sort of planet you overlooked. At a surface glance, it was fairly average. Breathable atmosphere, temperate climate, and mixed biomes of forests, rocky mountains, plains, and plateaus. From orbit, it looked perfectly pleasant, but that all changed the moment you landed. With notable exceptions, Voss was not a friendly world. Its landscape was populated by large, aggressive predators that like ambushing and attacking passers-by. Most notably were the giant Varantiki, but many others like the Wingmaws, the Haranth, and the Morvors came together to make traversing the planet's surface a bit of a nightmare. But it wasn't just the fauna that was hostile on Voss. As we mentioned earlier, the planet featured many kinds of biomes. Most of these were regular old habitats, but two stood out as particularly hostile. The first were the Gormak lands that lay to the south of Voss. As their name suggested, these were rocky plains inhabited by the Gormak, whom we'll talk about more later on. The Gormak lands were a mass of huts, tents, and other more advanced defensive structures built by the Gormak. Since the Gormak were hostile to all Voss and outsiders, venturing into their territory was as good of an invitation for violence as suggesting a hut donate to charity or go on a diet. More interesting, however, was the case of the second horror region of Voss, aptly named the Nightmare Lands. It lay to the east, and for lack of a better descriptor, it was a cesspool of dark side energy. Habitats like this were prime examples of what dark side influence could do to the world. Wildlife tainted by the dark side grew monstrous and freakishly violent. The flora had been corrupted, turning into sprawling thorned branches that resembled tentacles, eventually forming the tainted forest. Even the water had been tainted. The defiled brook was a river that ran through the Nightmare Lands, carrying with it more dark side influence. The worst affected area, however, was in the center of the Nightmare Lands, surrounded by mountains. Navigating the rocky tunnels would bring you to a hidden plateau named the Dark Heart, a dark side locus so strong it drove visitors insane. It was littered with ancient ruins, some still sealed, some open, and an underground maze of tunnels. The flora and fauna was even more vicious, making it an overall unpleasant place to visit. But that was Voss in a nutshell, a planet of scenic autumn foliage with monstrous carnivores and twisted darkside horrors around every corner. It was this planet that the Voss and their sworn enemies, the Gormak, called home. Native to Voss, the Voss were a sentient humanoid species with an incredibly high rate of force sensitivity. Biologically, they were very sexually dimorphic. Male Voss had light blue skin and bright orange eyes, whereas the females had red skin and bright blue eyes. Their eyes were pupilless, and they were born with unique white markings all over their body. Regardless of gender, young Voss didn't mature sexually until marriage. When a male and female Voss married, a ceremony called the Rite of Ardor was performed, during which the newlyweds underwent a physical, sexual, and developmental change, awakening them to puberty. This way, the Voss believed, the bond between husband and wife was forged in fire and strengthened. Despite sharing their name with their homeworld, the Voss were a minority on their own planet, outnumbered manyfold by the Gormak, their mortal enemies. They lived in a single city, their capital of Voss-Ka, which was located at the top of a mountain. Despite their access to modern technology, the Voss maintained careful balance with their environment, relying heavily on traditional craft such as stone housing over metal. That said, The Voss also maintained smaller outposts outside their main city, but these were small-scale stations built to facilitate transportation and scouting. The only other place with a significant Voss population was the Shrine of Healing, a huge temple located to the northeast of Voss Ka through treacherous territory. This was where the Voss mystics lived and performed healing rituals on those who braved the pilgrimage to see them. The shrine, like the buildings in Voss Ka, had a very distinct style. The Voss were overall a very peaceful people, enjoying horticulture, art, and storytelling. They preferred to live in harmony with the world around them, focusing on their culture and their art, but they weren't given much choice. More on that in a moment. As you would expect from a population with a lot of Force sensitives, the Voss had a culture heavily influenced by the Force. At the top of Voss society was the Council of Three, made up by respected elders. But they weren't free to simply make decisions. Decisions, in fact, began as a vision. Voss mystics, who were gifted Voss Force sensitives, meditated at the Shrine of Healing or the Tower of Prophecy within the capital until they had a Force vision. That vision was passed on to the interpreters, a group of Voss that were charged with understanding the meaning of the vision. Once the meaning became clear, the Council of Three would decide on the course of action to address the vision, and this decision was respected by all. Important to note is that under no circumstances were mystics allowed to interpret their own visions. The process was broken down into very distinct steps, since it was believed each step required expertise. That is because visions were never wrong and served the greater good at all times. Even if they brought great suffering in the short term, it was believed that this was to prevent even greater suffering in the future. Such an example was when a vision led to a bloody civil war and a mass starvation, but was still hailed as correct, as it prevented something even worse. Whether or not these were just assurances the Voss told themselves, we will leave it up to you. In order to become a mystic, a Voss had to train for years and undergo grueling trials. Once achieving the rank, however, they would spend their days meditating, learning, and developing the Voss healing rituals. Mystics could even access the spirit world because of how connected they were to the Force and their homeworld. Through the spirit world, they could manifest their spirits in distant places or even speak to the living after death. Some mystics practiced the art of dream walking, but were considered outcasts for it by their brothers. If you weren't a mystic but still wanted to dedicate yourself to serving your people, you could become a Voss commando. Commandos were stationed around Voss Ka and the Shrine of Healing and made up the Voss's security force/army. Every adult Voss had to serve a mandatory term as a commando, but once their term was up, they had the choice of returning to civilian life or remaining in the military. They received reconnaissance and martial arts training. This ensured all Voss citizens could protect themselves and understood the sacrifice required to keep them all safe. So, why was a peaceful people so obsessed with defense and security? Well, it's time to talk about the other sentient race on Voss, the Gormak. The Gormak were sentients with green skin, flat faces, and frills on top of their heads that swept away from their eyes, which could be anything from red, orange, or blue. They had clawed hands and were overall powerfully built. They too had sexual dimorphism, with the females being slightly smaller and with no wall above their noses. Gormak were naturally gifted with technology and spent a great deal of effort into becoming starbound. They were also, to put it nicely, savage. Their culture was one of warfare and violence, with extreme hostility towards any non-Gormak. The Voss and Gormak were as alike as pedigree cats and rabid dogs, and they got along just as well. You see, once upon a very long time ago, there were just the Gormak. At some point after the Second Great Schism, the Sith found Voss and began harvesting the world. They ignored the Gormak, whom they thought primitive and savage. However, the Jedi followed the Sith, aiming to fight them off the planet. They sought allies among the locals and turned to the Gormak. They trained some of their sensitive tribes in the Force, and these Gormak would go on to evolve into the Voss. In essence, the Voss were descended from the Gormak, their ancient enemies, and had shrugged off their violent ways under the influence of the Jedi. The two sentients never got along. They fought constantly, but the Voss were never trying to win. They had received a vision that forbade it. In the words of Jadek II, the last Gormak must not die. There was no discussion. The interpretation was clear. If every Gormak dies, every Voss dies. This is true. Wage war, but do not win. Survive, for total victory is death. The eternal war with the Gormak weren't the Voss's only problem. The Sith presence on Voss led to the dark side manifestation taking shape in a sentient evil entity that came to be known as Sel Makor. This entity resided in a Sith structure in the Dark Heart, which you remember as the rotten heart of the Nightmare Land Onion. If that weren't enough, in the years after the Great Galactic War and the Cold War, Voss was contested by both the Jedi and the Sith, and later ravaged by the Eternal Empire. The planet and Voskar were carpet-bombed, invaded, and occupied, along with much, much more. But that's a story for another day.